When we turn our attention to the early years of Baruch Spinoza, we are not merely tracing a chronology of dates and events. We are stepping into a world in which a young man of Portuguese Jewish descent found himself caught between the ancient currents of his own community and the fierce, new tides of the Dutch Golden Age. Born in Amsterdam on the 24th of November, 1632, Spinoza entered a city that glittered with commerce, where the scent of spices from the east mingled with the smell of fresh-cut timber from the shipyards. His parents, Miguel and Hannah, had fled the Inquisition in Portugal, seeking refuge among the burgeoning Sephardic diaspora that had taken root in the tolerant, mercantile atmosphere of the United Provinces. Their home was modest, yet it was suffused with the Hebrew prayers of the synagogue, the rhythmic chant of the Torah, and the whispered stories of a people who had survived exile, persecution, and the relentless search for a place to call home. From the very beginning, Spinoza was steeped in the twin languages of his heritage, the sacred texts of Judaism and the practical vernacular of Dutch commerce. At the age of 5, he was sent to the Talmud Torah, the traditional Jewish school where he learned to read and recite the Hebrew scriptures, to study the Mishnah and the Talmud, and to absorb the moral teachings of the sages. It was here, in the dimly lit study hall, that he first encountered the rigorous dialectic method that would later become a cornerstone of his own philosophical practice. The teachers, well versed in the commentaries of Maimonides, would challenge their pupils to reconcile apparent contradictions, to seek a deeper unity beneath the surface of law. In that environment, the young Baruch learned to question, to argue, and to look for the underlying principles that knit together a complex system of thought. Yet the world outside the synagogue walls was changing at a pace that would have seemed unimaginable a generation earlier. The 17th century was a time when the very foundations of knowledge were being reshaped. Galileo Galilei, with his telescope, had lifted the heavens into view and declared that the earth revolved around the sun. René Descartes, a French mathematician and philosopher, was formulating a method of doubt that began with the simple proclamation, cogito ergo sum. The scientific revolution was not a distant abstraction. Its ideas filtered through the coffee houses of Amsterdam, through the pamphlets printed on cheap paper, and through the lively debates of the Dutch Republic's intellectual salons. In this climate, the old certainties of scholasticism were being challenged, and a new spirit of inquiry, one that prized observation, reason, and the search for universal laws, was taking hold. Spinoza's own education reflected this synthesis of tradition and innovation. While his formal schooling in the Jewish community continued until he was about 15, his curiosity soon led him beyond the confines of the Talmud Torah. He began to attend the lectures of the Dutch Latin school, where he studied the works of Aristotle, Euclid, and the Stoics. He also encountered the writings of the humanists Erasmus, Pico della Mirandola, who championed the dignity of the individual and the potential for human reason to rise above superstition. It was a rare confluence, a young Sephardic Jew, fluent in Hebrew, Portuguese, and Dutch, navigating both the rabbinic world of his ancestors and the burgeoning secular academy of his adopted homeland. By the time he reached his early 20s, Spinoza had already begun to feel the weight of his community's expectations. In 1656, at the age of 24, he was summoned before the governing board of the Portuguese Jewish congregation, the Mamad, to answer for his unorthodox views. The precise accusations remain a matter of scholarly debate, but the records indicate that he had been questioning the literal interpretation of the Torah, expressing doubts about the divine origin of the prophetic texts, and perhaps, most scandalously, entertaining the idea that God might be understood not as a personal, anthropomorphic being, but as an abstract, rational principle underlying the universe. The Mamad, charged with preserving the cohesion and orthodoxy of the community, responded with a severe measure, excommunication or cherem. The edict was swift and unequivocal. Spinoza was barred from the synagogue, from participating in communal affairs, and from receiving any assistance from the community's charitable funds. In a single stark sentence, the congregation declared that he was a dangerous heretic whose ideas threatened the very fabric of Jewish life in Amsterdam. It is here that one of the most vivid anecdotes of Spinoza's early life unfolds. The day after his excommunication, a group of his former classmates gathered at the newly built Portuguese synagogue on the Jodenbriestraat. The building, with its lofty vaulted ceiling and elegant wooden benches, had been a source of pride for the community, a symbol of their resilience and prosperity. As the congregation sang the opening prayers, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance. A young man, his face flushed with anger, thrust a piece of parchment into the hands of the rabbi. The paper was a copy of Spinoza's manuscript, a draft of what would later become his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. The rabbi, recognizing the text, turned pale. He read a passage in which Spinoza argued that the authority of Scripture should be judged by the same rational criteria applied to any other book. The rabbi's voice trembled as he declared that this was a direct affront to the divine authority of the Torah. The congregation, shocked, fell silent. The incident became known as the Amsterdam Synagogue Incident, a moment when the private doubts of a single thinker were thrust into the public eye, exposing the fragile line between communal loyalty and intellectual freedom. The excommunication forced Spinoza into a new mode of existence. Deprived of the communal safety net, he turned to a modest trade, lens grinding. In the workshops of the Amsterdam glassmakers, he found a quiet space to contemplate the nature of light, of perception, and of the very act of seeing. The precision required to shape a lens, to polish it to a flawless finish, mirrored the exacting clarity he would later demand of philosophical argument. It is no coincidence that his most celebrated work, the Ethics, is structured with the rigor of a geometric proof, each proposition building upon the previous one as surely as a lens focuses scattered rays into a single point. In this sense, the adversity he faced sharpened his methodological discipline. Stripped of institutional support, he could no longer rely on authority. He had to construct his own foundation, stone by stone, proposition by proposition. Even as he labored in his workshop, Spinoza remained in contact with a clandestine network of thinkers who shared his appetite for radical ideas. He began to circulate his manuscripts in secret, entrusting them to a few trusted friends who would copy them by hand and pass them along to sympathetic scholars in other cities. One such episode illustrates the care with which he guarded his work. In 1660, a young merchant named Jan Rotz, a fellow Sephardic Jew who had survived the Inquisition, approached Spinoza with a request to borrow a copy of his geometrical demonstrations. Rotz, aware of the danger, agreed to meet Spinoza in the narrow alley behind the house of a tobacco merchant, a location chosen precisely because it lay beyond the sight of the Mamad's watchful eyes. There, under the dim glow of a single lantern, Spinoza handed over a parchment bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He whispered, "Guard this as you would your own life, for the world is not yet ready for the truth it contains." Rotz nodded, understanding that the manuscript was more than a text. It was a fragile vessel of a new metaphysics that could easily be shattered by the forces of orthodoxy. The secretive circulation of his manuscripts not only protected Spinoza from immediate persecution, but also allowed his ideas to spread beyond the borders of the Dutch Republic. Copies of his Ethics and Tractatus found their way to the salons of Paris, the courts of London, and the academies of Berlin. In each place, they sparked both admiration and alarm, prompting a cascade of responses that would shape the trajectory of modern philosophy. It is essential at this juncture to situate Spinoza among his contemporaries. Thomas Hobbes, the English political philosopher, was publishing Leviathan in 1651, arguing for a sovereign power derived from a social contract, a view that placed human reason above divine right. Hobbes and Spinoza shared a belief in the primacy of rational analysis, yet they diverged sharply on the nature of substance. Hobbes maintained a materialist universe where everything could be reduced to motion and extension, while Spinoza would later propose a monist ontology, identifying God with nature itself, a bold synthesis that would later be labeled pantheism. Their points of convergence lie in their rejection of scholastic dualisms and their insistence that the laws governing the cosmos could be discovered through reason. Yet the divergence is stark. Hobbes' God is a distant, often irrelevant backdrop to human politics, whereas Spinoza's God is the very substance of all that exists, immanent in every leaf, every thought, every breath. Another contemporary, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, was still in his infancy when Spinoza was forging his early ideas, but the two would later become emblematic of the rationalist tradition. Leibniz, in his monadology, posited an infinite number of simple substances, monads each reflecting the whole universe from its own perspective. Spinoza's single substance, by contrast, collapsed the multiplicity into a unified whole. Both philosophers, however, grappled with the problem of evil, the nature of freedom, and the role of God in a deterministic framework. Their early points of contact, such as the shared belief that the mind and body are not fundamentally separate, but rather aspects of a single reality, set the stage for a philosophical dialogue that would echo through the centuries. The intellectual climate of the Dutch Golden Age provided fertile ground for such debates. The Republic, with its relative religious tolerance, its thriving printing industry, and its bustling ports, attracted scholars, merchants, and artists from across Europe. The coffee houses of Amsterdam were not merely places for trade. They were crucibles of ideas, where a Dutch merchant might discuss the latest findings of the Royal Society with a French Huguenot refugee, while a Sephardic Jew recited verses from Maimonides. In this cosmopolitan milieu, the boundaries between faith and reason, between tradition and innovation, were constantly being renegotiated. Spinoza's own Jewish philosophical lineage also played a crucial role in shaping his thought. Maimonides, the 12th century Andalusian philosopher, had attempted to harmonize Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish theology, arguing that the true purpose of the commandments was to cultivate intellectual virtue. Spinoza inherited this rationalist impulse but pushed it further, stripping away the anthropomorphic elements of God and reinterpreting the commandments as ethical guides derived from the natural order. Additionally, the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, with its emphasis on the hidden emanative aspects of the divine, left an imprint on Spinoza's language of attributes and modes. While he would later distance himself from overt mysticism, the Kabbalistic notion that God's essence could be approached through symbolic interpretation resonated with his own project of revealing the underlying structure of reality through reason. Yet not everyone welcomed Spinoza's bold synthesis. Early critics emerged swiftly, seeking to undermine his rationalist project. One of the most vocal was Johannes Baumeister, a Dutch Calvinist scholar who published a pamphlet in 1665 titled De Onrechtvaardigheid der Spinozistische Philosophie, on the injustice of Spinozist philosophy. Baumeister argued that Spinoza's identification of God with nature amounted to a denial of divine providence and moral responsibility. He wrote, "If God is merely the sum of natural laws, then the very foundation of moral law crumbles. There is no higher authority to bind us, no divine judge to reward virtue and punish vice." Baumeister's pamphlet appealed to the popular fear that rationalism would erode the social order, and it resonated with those who saw Spinoza's ideas as a threat to both religious and political stability. A second line of criticism came from within the Jewish community itself, articulated most sharply in a pamphlet attributed to the rabbi of the Portuguese congregation, Isaac de Pinto. Though the pamphlet's authorship remains disputed, its content reflects the communal anxiety over Spinoza's influence. It accused him of spiritual treason, claiming that his doctrine reduced the divine covenant to a mere philosophical abstraction. The pamphlet warned that the spread of such ideas will lead the faithful into moral relativism, where the commandments are no longer binding but subject to the whims of human reason. This critique highlighted a central tension. Spinoza's insistence that reason could illuminate ethical truths was perceived by many as an affront to the authority of revealed law. Both Baumeister's and de Pinto's objections centered on a shared fear that rational inquiry might unmoor humanity from its moral compass. Yet Spinoza anticipated these concerns. In the Ethics, he famously wrote, "The more we understand the causes of our emotions, the more we become free." For Spinoza, freedom was not the libertine license of unchecked desire, but the empowerment that comes from understanding the deterministic order of nature and aligning oneself with it. By recognizing that what we call passions are merely modifications of the body, we can cultivate adequate ideas and achieve a kind of intellectual love of God, amor intellectualis Dei, that transcends superstition. The personal circumstances of Spinoza's life, his excommunication, his work as a lens grinder, his clandestine manuscript network, cannot be divorced from this methodological rigor. Stripped of institutional protection, he was compelled to develop a philosophy that could stand on its own logical merits, independent of ecclesiastical endorsement. His use of the Euclidean deductive method, his careful definition of terms, his insistence on proving each proposition before proceeding, all reflect a mind that understood the stakes of being a solitary thinker in a hostile environment. In a sense, his life was a laboratory where the variables of exile, poverty, and intellectual curiosity combined to produce a theory that sought to reconcile the material and the spiritual, the deterministic and the free. To bring this historical portrait into sharper relief, let us consider another anecdote that illustrates Spinoza's relentless pursuit of truth, even in the face of danger. In 1669, a group of scholars gathered at the house of the wealthy merchant Jacob de Haan, a patron of the arts and a sympathizer of Spinoza's ideas. The evening began with a modest dinner, but soon the conversation turned to the nature of substance. De Haan, eager to test Spinoza's arguments, posed a challenge. "If God is the cause of everything, then why does evil exist?" Spinoza, with a calm, measured voice, replied, "Evil is not a positive force but a lack, a privation of the good, much like darkness is the absence of light." He went on to explain that what we label as evil arises from inadequate ideas, from ignorance of the necessary causal chain that governs the universe. The room fell silent, and a few of the guests, accustomed to the more conventional theodicies of their time, left the gathering with a new, unsettling perspective. This episode, recorded in the diary of a contemporary observer, illustrates how Spinoza's philosophy was not merely abstract speculation, but a living, provocative discourse that challenged the moral assumptions of his peers. As we reflect on these moments, excommunication, secret manuscript exchange, the synagogue incident, the salon debates, we see a pattern emerging. Spinoza's life was a series of confrontations between the authority of tradition and the authority of reason. Each confrontation forced him to refine his arguments, to anticipate objections, and to construct a system that could withstand scrutiny from both religious and secular critics. His methodological rigor, therefore, was not a detached academic exercise. It was a survival strategy, a way of ensuring that his ideas could endure beyond the fickle judgments of any single community. In the broader tapestry of early modern philosophy, Spinoza occupies a unique position. He stands at the crossroads where the Renaissance humanism that celebrated human potential meets the scientific revolution that demanded empirical verification. He bridges the Jewish philosophical tradition, rooted in Maimonides' rationalism and the mystical aspirations of the Kabbalah, with the emerging secular rationalism of Descartes, Hobbes, and later Leibniz. His insistence that God and nature are one, that the universe operates according to immutable laws discoverable by reason, anticipates the Enlightenment's confidence in human intellect. Yet his emphasis on the ethical implications of this metaphysics, on the cultivation of adequate ideas, on the transformation of passive emotions into active understanding, offers a depth that goes beyond mere natural philosophy. When we consider the influence of Renaissance humanism on Spinoza, we must recall the humanist credo that the dignity of man is rooted in the capacity for self-knowledge and moral agency. This credo resonated with Spinoza's belief that the highest good is the intellectual love of God, a love that arises from understanding the rational structure of reality. Humanists such as Erasmus had argued that the study of classical texts could free the mind from superstition. Spinoza took this further, proposing that the study of nature itself, through mathematics, geometry, and physics, could free the mind from the tyranny of dogma. The scientific revolution, meanwhile, provided Spinoza with a model for how knowledge could be organized. Galileo's telescopic observations revealed that appearances could be deceiving, that the heavens were not immutable spheres but dynamic realms governed by the same laws as Earth. Descartes' meditations introduced a method of systematic doubt, a way to strip away preconceived notions and arrive at indubitable foundations. Spinoza adopted and transformed these methods. He began each part of the ethics with a series of definitions, axioms, and propositions, mirroring the structure of Euclid's elements. In doing so, he signaled that philosophy, like geometry, could achieve the same certainty, provided it adhered to rigorous logical steps. Yet despite these commonalities, Spinoza's synthesis diverged sharply from Descartes on the nature of mind and body. Descartes famously posited a dualism, mind as a thinking, non-extended substance, and body as an extended, non-thinking substance. Spinoza rejected this split, arguing that there is only one substance with infinite attributes, of which thought and extension are two ways of perceiving the same reality. This monistic view was radical, and it placed Spinoza at odds not only with religious orthodoxy, but also with the dominant philosophical paradigm of his time. The early criticisms of Spinoza's rationalist approach, such as those articulated by Baumeister, underscore the broader cultural anxiety about the limits of reason. Baumeister's pamphlet warned that if everything could be reduced to natural law, then the moral order would collapse. Spinoza's response, found in the Ethics, is subtle yet powerful. The more we understand the causes of things, the more we are able to act according to the necessity of nature, and thereby achieve a freedom that is not the absence of constraints, but the alignment with the true causes. In this way, Spinoza reframed freedom not as rebellion against determinism, but as participation in the rational order itself. The Jewish community's own response, as voiced by the pamphlet attributed to Rabbi Isaac de Pinto, reflected a fear that Spinoza's rationalism would erode the communal bonds forged by shared ritual and belief. Yet paradoxically, Spinoza's emphasis on the universality of reason also offered a path toward a more inclusive ethic, one that could transcend sectarian divisions. By locating the divine in the natural order, he opened the possibility for a moral framework that did not depend on particular religious commandments, but on the shared human capacity for understanding. In the years that followed, Spinoza's ideas continued to ripple outward. The secretive circulation of his manuscripts, once a necessity for his safety, became a conduit for the spread of modern rationalist thought across Europe. Scholars in Paris, such as Pierre Bayle, engaged with his work, sometimes with hostility, sometimes with admiration. In England, the early Enlightenment thinkers, including John Locke, encountered Spinoza's arguments about the nature of ideas and the limits of knowledge, even as they diverged on political implications. Leibniz, though he would later criticize Spinoza's monism as the doctrine of the universe as a substance, nonetheless acknowledged the depth of Spinoza's metaphysical system, calling it the most powerful and comprehensive system of the age. The legacy of these early encounters is evident in the way Spinoza's thought has been appropriated, contested, and reinterpreted over the centuries. In the 19th century, German idealists such as Hegel saw in Spinoza a precursor to the notion of the absolute spirit, while later existentialists like Sartre would grapple with the implications of a deterministic universe for human freedom. In contemporary philosophy, the resurgence of interest in Spinoza's ethics, his concept of conatus, the striving of each thing to persist in its being, has influenced discussions on environmental ethics, political theory, and even neuroscience, where the idea that emotions are rooted in bodily states finds empirical support. Returning to the early period of 1656 to 1677, we see a young philosopher whose life was marked by exile, by the loss of communal belonging, and by the relentless pursuit of a rational understanding of the world. The Portuguese Jewish heritage that gave him a rich textual tradition, the intellectual ferment of the Dutch Golden Age that offered new scientific tools, and the personal hardships that forced him into solitary labor, all these elements converged to shape a thinker of extraordinary methodological rigor. His excommunication was not merely a personal tragedy, it was the crucible in which his philosophy was forged, compelling him to develop a system that could stand without the scaffolding of institutional authority. In the final analysis, the early years of Spinoza's life are more than a biographical footnote, they are the very foundation upon which his philosophical edifice rests. The anecdotes of the synagogue incident and the secret manuscript exchanges illuminate how ideas can be both fragile and resilient, how the act of sharing a text can be an act of rebellion, and how a community's attempt to silence a thinker can inadvertently amplify his voice across generations. By examining the cross-references to Hobbes, Descartes, and Leibniz, we recognize that Spinoza was both a product of his time and a radical departure from it. The counter-arguments of Baumeister and the rabbinic pamphleteers remind us that every philosophical system invites critique, that the dialogue between reason and tradition is an ongoing, dynamic process. Thus, as we listen to the echo of Spinoza's early footsteps through the narrow streets of 17th-century Amsterdam, we hear not only the clatter of glass lenses and the rustle of parchment, but also the steady rhythm of a mind that, despite exile and opposition, pursued a vision of a universe bound together by rational law, where freedom is achieved through understanding, and where the love of God is, at its core, the love of truth. This is the story of a man whose personal circumstances shaped not merely his methodology, but the very content of his philosophy, a story that continues to reverberate in the corridors of modern thought. Imagine for a moment that the universe is not a collection of disparate islands, but a single, boundless ocean whose depths we are only beginning to fathom. In the mind of Baruch Spinoza, that ocean is not merely a metaphor, it is the very substance of all that exists, a substance he famously names Deus sive Natura, God or nature. As we step into this segment on Spinoza's metaphysics, let us move slowly, as if walking along a quiet shore, and let each concept settle like a gentle wave upon the sand of our understanding. Spinoza begins his ethics with a series of definitions, axioms, propositions, and proofs that echo the rigor of Euclid's geometry. He writes, "The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things." This opening axiom sets the stage for a philosophical system in which the structure of thought mirrors the structure of reality. Just as Euclid starts with points, lines, and planes, Spinoza starts with the most fundamental notion, substance. He defines substance as that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, a substance does not need anything else to exist or to be understood. It is self-sufficient, self-caused, and infinite. From this definition flow the first two axioms that underpin his entire metaphysical edifice. Axiom 1 declares that everything which is in itself determined to exist and to act in a certain way. Axiom 2 adds that two things are equal if the same attributes can be predicated of each. These are not idle statements. They are the logical scaffolding that allows Spinoza to deduce, with geometric precision, that there can be only one substance. If there were two substances, they would have to differ in some attribute, and that difference would imply that one depends on the other for its existence, contradicting the very definition of substance as self-caused. Thus, the conclusion follows, there is one and only one substance, infinite in its nature, and that substance is what we call God or nature. The equation God equals nature, or more precisely Deus sive Natura, is perhaps the most striking line in Spinoza's work. It is not a poetic flourish but a logical identity. When Spinoza writes, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God," he is stating that every mode, every attribute, every finite thing is a modification of the one infinite substance. The phrase Deus sive Natura therefore does not separate the divine from the material world. It collapses the gap, insisting that the divine is the totality of the natural order, and the natural order is the expression of the divine. To make this abstract claim more tangible, let us consider two concrete examples that illustrate the distinction between attributes and modes. First, the attribute of thought. For Spinoza, thought is an infinite way in which the one substance expresses itself. It is not a mental activity confined to human brains. It is the very capacity of the substance to think. When you have a fleeting idea, a memory of a childhood song, that particular thought is a mode of the attribute of thought. It is a finite, particular expression, a modification of the infinite attribute, just as a single wave is a mode of the infinite ocean. Second, the attribute of extension. Extension is the infinite way in which the substance occupies space. A physical object, a stone, a tree, a planet, is a mode of extension. The stone's shape, its mass, its location in space are all finite expressions of the infinite attribute of extension. In Spinoza's geometry, thought and extension run parallel, never intersecting, yet they are two aspects of the same underlying reality. This parallelism is captured in Proposition 15 of Part I. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. When you see a tree, you are simultaneously perceiving an idea of the tree. The idea and the thing share the same logical order because they are both modes of the one substance. Spinoza's methodical style mirrors Euclid's in more than form. It mirrors Euclid's ambition to reduce the complex to the simple, to derive a multitude of truths from a handful of self-evident premises. Just as Euclid proves the properties of circles from the definition of a point and a line, Spinoza proves the existence of God, the eternity of the soul, and the necessity of nature's laws from his definitions and axioms. This geometric approach is not a mere stylistic choice. It reflects his conviction that metaphysics, like geometry, can achieve certainty. He writes, "The more the mind understands, the more it loves." By understanding the necessary structure of reality, we are led to a love of the whole, an intellectual love, or amor intellectualis Dei, that is the highest form of blessedness. Now let us turn to the historical currents that carried Spinoza's ideas into the world and the turbulence they provoked. In 1663, the young philosopher, then a relatively unknown figure in the Dutch Republic, completed a manuscript of his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a bold treatise that argued for the separation of philosophy and theology and for the freedom of thought. The manuscript was seized by the authorities of the Dutch Reformed Church, who feared its potential to undermine religious orthodoxy. The seizure was not merely an act of censorship. It was a vivid illustration of the very stakes at play when a thinker declares that God is identical with nature. The Church, which had long claimed a transcendent, personal deity, found itself confronted by a philosophy that denied any such separation. Spinoza's manuscript, hidden away in a drawer for months, was eventually smuggled out and circulated among a circle of sympathetic scholars, planting the seeds of what would later become the Enlightenment's emphasis on rational inquiry. 6 years later, in 1670, Spinoza's Tractatus finally emerged into the public sphere, printed in Latin under the title Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. The Latin edition was not simply a translation. It was a strategic choice. Latin, the lingua franca of scholars across Europe, ensured that the work could bypass local censorship and reach a broader intellectual audience. The publication caused a stir throughout the Republic of Letters. Scholars in Paris, London, and Frankfurt debated its propositions, and the work became a touchstone for discussions on religious tolerance, the nature of political authority, and the limits of metaphysical speculation. The very fact that the Tractatus survived seizure, translation, and publication underscores the resilience of Spinoza's ideas and their capacity to challenge entrenched power structures. Yet Spinoza's monistic vision was not without formidable opponents. The first major counterargument came from René Descartes, whose dualism posited two distinct substances. Res cogitans, the thinking substance, and res extensa, the extended substance. Descartes argued that mind and body are fundamentally different, each with its own essence. He wrote, "I think, therefore I am," emphasizing the certainty of the thinking self as a distinct, indubitable foundation. From this standpoint, the idea of a single substance that is simultaneously thought and extension appears incoherent. If thought and extension are fundamentally different, how can they be two attributes of the same underlying reality? Descartes would respond that the very notion of attributing both thought and extension to a single substance collapses the clear distinction that he believes is essential to avoid confusion between mental and physical realms. Spinoza's reply, embedded in Proposition 11 of Part I, is elegant. God, or substance, consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. Here, the infinite nature of the substance guarantees that each attribute is a complete expression of the same essence, not a fragmentary addition. The infinite substance does not suffer from the limitation that afflicts finite beings. It can be both thinking and extended without contradiction. In this way, Spinoza turns Descartes' own principle of clear and distinct ideas against him, arguing that the clarity of his geometric method reveals the necessity of a single, infinite substance. A second, equally powerful objection originates from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who introduced the principle of sufficient reason, the claim that nothing happens without a reason why it is so rather than otherwise. Leibniz argued that if God were identical with nature, then the very existence of the world would be necessary, leaving no room for contingency or the freedom that the principle of sufficient reason seems to demand. He wrote, "God's will is not arbitrary, it follows from the best of all possible worlds." For Leibniz, the world is contingent, chosen by a rational deity among many possibilities. Spinoza, by contrast, asserts that everything follows necessarily from the nature of the one substance. There is no room for alternative possibilities. The universe, in Spinoza's view, is the logical unfolding of the divine essence, a necessary chain of causes that leaves no room for a best among many selection. Spinoza anticipates this critique in Proposition 29, where he argues that the existence of God is evident by the very nature of the concept of God. The necessity of God's existence is not a contingent choice, but a logical consequence of the definition of God as an absolutely infinite being. In this sense, the principle of sufficient reason is preserved, but its scope is narrowed. The sufficient reason for any particular state of affairs is found in the nature of the one substance itself, not in a divine will that arbitrarily selects one world over another. The universe's regularity, its laws, and its particular events are all expressions of the single, necessary cause. Let us pause to consider a modern analogy that can help us grasp this shift from multiple substances to a single one. Picture a vast, multidimensional field. Think of the electromagnetic field that permeates space. In contemporary physics, particles are not isolated little billiard balls. They are excitations, ripples, or localized disturbances of an underlying field. The field itself is the fundamental entity. The particles are modes of the field, temporary patterns that arise and dissipate. Spinoza's substance functions much like this field, an all-encompassing reality that manifests itself in countless particular ways, each mode a localized expression of the infinite. Just as a photon is a mode of the electromagnetic field, an individual thought is a mode of the attribute of thought, and a rock is a mode of the attribute of extension. This field analogy leads us to a contemporary philosophical current known as pan-experientialism, which holds that experience, or proto-consciousness, is a fundamental feature of reality. Thinkers such as Philip Goff and Galen Strawson have argued that experience is not something that emerges only at the level of complex brains, but is woven into the fabric of the universe itself. Spinoza's claim that thought and extension are two attributes of the same substance anticipates this line of thought. If the one substance possesses both mental and physical aspects, then even the most elementary modes, perhaps the vibration of an electron or the bending of a light ray, participate, in a minimal sense, in the attribute of thought. In this way, Spinoza can be read as an early proponent of a kind of pan-experientialism, long before the term entered philosophical discourse. The relevance of Spinoza's metaphysics also extends into the realm of modern physics, particularly in the development of field theory and the quest for a unified description of forces. In the early 20th century, physicists such as James Clerk Maxwell and later the architects of quantum field theory sought to describe electromagnetism, the weak and strong nuclear forces, and gravity as manifestations of underlying fields. The dream of a theory of everything mirrors Spinoza's aspiration to see the multiplicity of phenomena as different expressions of a single, underlying reality. While the mathematics of quantum field theory is far more elaborate than Spinoza's geometric proofs, the philosophical thrust is resonant. Both seek a monistic foundation that can account for the diversity of experience without resorting to dualistic splits. Let us return now to the lived implications of this metaphysical picture. If everything is a mode of the one substance, then the distinction between self and other, between mind and world, softens. Ethical behavior, for Spinoza, becomes an expression of understanding this unity. He writes in Ethics, Part V, Proposition 15, the more we understand, the more we love. By recognizing that our own thoughts are not isolated islands but ripples in the infinite attribute of thought, we develop an intellectual love for the whole. This love is not sentimental, it is rational, grounded in the knowledge of necessity. In practical terms, this leads to a form of ethical naturalism. We ought to act in ways that enhance our understanding of the necessary order, because such actions align us with the very nature of the substance that we are part of. Consider a concrete real-world application: environmental stewardship. If the forest, the river, and the human mind are all modes of the same infinite substance, then harming the forest is, in a profound sense, harming a mode of the same reality that sustains our own thought. The distinction between nature and human collapses, and a rational love of the whole translates into concrete policies that protect ecosystems, not merely for instrumental reasons, but because the health of the whole reflects upon the health of each mode, including our own minds. Spinoza's metaphysics thus provides a philosophical grounding for a deep ecological ethic, one that sees the preservation of natural systems as a form of self-preservation. Another sphere where Spinoza's ideas find resonance is in the field of psychotherapy, particularly in approaches that emphasize acceptance and cognitive reframing. The modern practice of mindfulness, for instance, encourages individuals to observe thoughts as fleeting modes of the mind rather than as defining essences. When a therapist says, "Notice that this anxiety is a passing mode of the attribute of thought, not the totality of who you are," the language echoes Spinoza's distinction between substance and mode. By cultivating this perspective, patients can reduce identification with transient mental states, thereby achieving a calmer, more resilient mind, a therapeutic embodiment of Spinoza's Amor Intellectualis Dei. To deepen our appreciation of Spinoza's historical context, let us revisit the anecdote of the 1663 manuscript seizure. The city of Amsterdam, a bustling hub of trade and ideas, was also a place where religious authorities guarded their doctrinal borders vigilantly. When the authorities confiscated Spinoza's Tractatus, they did so under the pretext of protecting public order. Yet the very act of seizing the manuscript highlighted a paradox: the power of ideas to destabilize established structures. The seizure inadvertently amplified interest in Spinoza's work as rumors spread through coffee houses and salons. In a sense, the attempt to suppress the text served to illustrate the inevitability of the very principle Spinoza championed, that the rational order of ideas cannot be arbitrarily halted by external forces. The manuscript's eventual escape and clandestine circulation underscore the resilience of a philosophy that insists on the necessity of its own existence. The second anecdote, the 1670 Latin publication, offers a contrasting scene. By the time the Tractatus appeared in print, Spinoza had already endured exile from the Jewish community in Amsterdam, a community that had once nurtured his early education. The decision to publish in Latin, the language of scholars, was a strategic move to place his ideas beyond the immediate reach of local censorship, while inviting the broader European intellectual community into dialogue. The first printed copies traveled to the libraries of Leiden, Paris, and Oxford, where they were read alongside the works of Descartes, Hobbes, and later, Laban. The Tractatus sparked a wave of correspondence, with figures like Pierre Bayle and John Locke engaging with Spinoza's arguments. The very act of publication, then, became a catalyst for a transnational exchange of ideas, demonstrating how a single philosophical text could ripple across continents, much like a mode propagating through an infinite field. Returning to the philosophical heart of the matter, let us examine more closely the famous equation that has become a shorthand for Spinoza's monism: Deus equals Natura. This equation is not a simplistic identification, but a profound claim about identity. In the Ethics Part I, Definition 6, Spinoza writes, God is a being absolutely infinite, that is, a being consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses infinite essence. He then adds, by nature I understand the totality of the universe, the totality of all that exists. When he equates the two, he is saying that the infinite being he calls God is precisely the totality of the universe. This identity eliminates the traditional theistic gap between creator and creation. It also dissolves the problem of divine hiddenness. If God is the world itself, there is no need for a hidden, transcendent deity. The divine is manifest in every particle, every thought, every law. One might ask, does this identification diminish the reverence traditionally accorded to God? Spinoza would answer that reverence is transformed, not diminished. He writes, the more we understand God, the more we love him. Understanding, for Spinoza, is an intellectual love that arises from recognizing the necessary order of things. The awe inspired by a starry sky, by the elegance of a mathematical proof, becomes a rational appreciation of the very substance that underlies both. In this way, the equation Deus equals Natura reframes piety as a contemplative engagement with the natural order, rather than a ritualistic worship of an external entity. Let us now consider how this monistic view interacts with the principle of causality. In the Ethics, Spinoza establishes a deterministic chain. Every mode follows from the necessity of the one substance's nature. There is no room for random contingency. Each event is a necessary consequence of the preceding one, just as each geometric theorem follows inexorably from axioms. This deterministic picture has often been criticized as undermining human freedom. Yet Spinoza offers a nuanced account of freedom, which he defines not as the ability to act arbitrarily, but as the understanding of necessity. In Proposition 29 of Part II, he writes, "The more the mind knows, the more it is free." Freedom, then, is the intellectual assent to the necessary order, a freedom that is compatible with determinism, because it is rooted in knowledge rather than in caprice. Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, which demands an explanation for every fact, appears at first to clash with Spinoza's deterministic necessity. However, both philosophers can be seen as seeking a comprehensive explanatory framework, albeit with different emphases. Leibniz's metaphysical pluralism, with its monads each containing a pre-established harmony, offers a different route to sufficient reason. Each monad state is sufficient in itself because it reflects the whole. Spinoza's single substance offers a more parsimonious answer. The sufficient reason for any mode lies in the nature of the one substance. In this sense, both philosophers are converging on a view that the universe is not a brute fact, but a rationally intelligible whole. The dialogue between Spinoza and later thinkers continues into the 20th century. Phenomenologists such as Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, while not explicitly Spinozist, grapple with the relationship between consciousness and world in ways that echo the attribute-mode framework. Husserl's notion of the life world as a pre-theoretical horizon of meaning can be read as a modern incarnation of the attribute of thought, while Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on the body as the primary site of perception resonates with the attribute of extension. Both philosophers, like Spinoza, seek to dissolve the strict separation between subject and object, suggesting that the world is always already given to consciousness, and consciousness is always already world-bound. In contemporary analytic philosophy, the debate over physicalism versus dualism often circles back to Spinoza's arguments. Physicalists who maintain that everything is ultimately physical sometimes adopt a reductionist stance that denies the reality of mental attributes as anything more than epiphenomena. Spinoza, by granting thought full ontological status as an attribute of the one substance, provides a middle path. Mental phenomena are not reducible to mere physical configurations, but they are not separate substances either. This nuanced position anticipates modern non-reductive physicalism, which holds that mental properties emerge from, yet are not identical to, physical substrates. Let us illustrate the attribute-mode distinction with a second example, this time drawn from everyday experience. Imagine you are listening to a piece of music, a symphony that swells, recedes, and resolves. The melody you hear, the emotional response it elicits, and the pattern of notes are all modes of the attribute of thought. Simultaneously, the vibrations of the air molecules, the movement of the violin strings, and the electrical signals in your auditory cortex are modes of the attribute of extension. The music, then, is a concrete instance where thought and extension intertwine, each reflecting the same underlying substance. When you feel moved by the music, you are experiencing the convergence of the two attributes within a single mode, a harmonious illustration of Spinoza's parallelism. Another everyday illustration involves the simple act of reaching for a cup of coffee. Your intention, the desire to drink, is a mode of thought. The movement of your arm, the grip on the mug, the heat of the liquid, all are modes of extension. In the moment of action, the mental and physical are not two separate realms colliding, but two expressions of the same substance coordinating in a single mode. This seamless integration challenges the Cartesian picture of mind pushing on body like two distinct entities, and instead supports Spinoza's claim that the world operates as a unified, self-causing system. We have now traversed a wide landscape, from the rigorous definitions and axioms that construct Spinoza's geometric metaphysics, through historical episodes that show the peril and persistence of his ideas, to the counterarguments raised by Descartes and Leibniz, and onward to modern interpretations in physics, pan-experientialism, and ethics. Each of these threads weaves together to form a richer tapestry, one that reveals the enduring relevance of Spinoza's claim that there is only one substance, infinite and self-sufficient, manifesting itself as both thought and extension. As we draw this segment to a close, let us linger on a final quotation from the Ethics, Part I, Proposition 15, which captures the spirit of Spinoza's metaphysical vision. Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God. This line, simple yet profound, invites us to reconsider the boundaries we draw between self and world, between mind and matter. If the universe is a single, infinite field of being, then every question we ask, every curiosity we pursue, is a mode of that field reaching back toward its source. The task of philosophy, then, is not to carve new divisions, but to illuminate the underlying unity that already exists. In the quiet moments after this reflection, perhaps you will sense a subtle shift, a loosening of the mental fences that separate you from the world, a gentle recognition that your thoughts, your body, the rustling leaves outside, and the distant stars are all part of one boundless reality. That recognition, cultivated through careful study and patient contemplation, is the very fruit Spinoza invites us to harvest: an intellectual love, a serene acceptance of necessity, and a profound sense of belonging to the infinite substance that is both God and nature. Let this understanding settle within you like a calm tide and carry you forward into the next chapter of our exploration. When we begin to untangle the threads of Baruch Spinoza's epistemology, it is helpful to imagine three ladders stretching upward from the ground of everyday experience, each rung representing a different way our mind grasps the world. The first ladder is built from what Spinoza calls the imagination, the sensus communis, a shared faculty that gathers the fleeting images and sensations that wash over us like the rush of wind through leaves. The second ladder is the faculty of reason, the ratio, which orders those images into universal relations, allowing us to see patterns that are not merely accidental but necessary. The third ladder, the most luminous of all, is intuitive knowledge, the scientia intuitiva, a kind of immediate, holistic insight into the very essence of things, a vision that sees the whole within a single glance. Spinoza's careful distinction among these three modes of knowledge is not an abstract taxonomy. It is a roadmap for how we might move from the fog of opinion to the clear light of truth. Consider first the naive perception of a tree standing on a country road. A child points, "That's a tree," and the mind registers the green of the leaves, the roughness of the bark, the rustle of wind. This is the work of the imagination. The images are collected, stored, and later recalled, but they remain particular and contingent. Spinoza would say that the imagination knows only the adequate ideas of the particular modes, the fleeting configurations of matter and motion that our senses catch. The child's knowledge is useful for navigating the world, yet it is limited because the imagination can be misled by illusion, by similarity that is not identity, by the tricks of perspective. As Spinoza writes in the Ethics, the imagination is a kind of knowledge which is not based upon the true nature of things, but upon the order of the external world as it appears to us. In this sense, the imagination is like a mosaic made of broken tiles. The picture is recognizable, but the edges are jagged, the colors sometimes false. Now imagine we turn to a different scene, one that takes us from the garden to the geometric plane. A student opens Euclid's Elements, draws a triangle, and follows the steps of a proof that the sum of its interior angles equals 2 right angles. The student is no longer relying on the fleeting images of a tree, but on a chain of logical deductions that follow from definitions, axioms, and previously proven propositions. Here the faculty of reason, the ratio, takes command. Reason seeks the necessary connections among ideas. It abstracts away from the particularities of the external world and works with concepts that are universal and immutable. Spinoza himself was a devoted student of Euclid, and he often described the method of deduction as the path of the mind from the particular to the universal, from the confused to the clear. The geometric proof is a model of rational knowledge. Each step follows inevitably from the previous one, and the conclusion is true in every possible world, not merely in the world we happen to inhabit. In the language of the Ethics, reason produces adequate ideas that correspond to the essence of the thing, ideas that are true because they reflect the necessary order of nature. The third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge, is perhaps the most mysterious, and yet it is the pinnacle of Spinoza's epistemic hierarchy. To illustrate, let us imagine a mystic who, in a moment of deep contemplation, perceives the essence of God, the infinite substance that Spinoza calls Deus sive Natura. This is not a knowledge obtained by counting the leaves of a tree or by measuring angles of a triangle. It is a direct, immediate grasp of the very nature of existence, a vision that sees the infinite in a single, indivisible act of understanding. Spinoza describes this as the knowledge by which the mind perceives the essence of the thing and is aware that this essence is contained in the essence of the mind. In intuitive knowledge, the distinction between subject and object collapses. The mind recognizes itself as a mode of the infinite substance, and in that recognition, it experiences a kind of intellectual love, the amor intellectualis Dei. The intuitive grasp of God's essence is not a proof that can be laid out step by step, but a holistic insight that once achieved transforms the knower. As Spinoza writes, the intuitive knowledge is the most certain, for it proceeds from the very nature of the mind itself. It is the knowledge that makes the infinite present, that turns the abstract idea of substance into lived experience. The transition from imagination to reason to intuition is not simply a linear progression, it is a deepening of the mind's capacity to form adequate ideas. Spinoza warns us that many people remain forever trapped in the realm of imagination, forever mistaking the shadows on the wall for reality. He likens the imagination to a flame that flickers in the night, casting shapes that are not the things themselves. Reason, by contrast, is a steady lamp that reveals the true contours of objects, while intuitive knowledge is the sunrise that dissolves the night entirely, revealing the whole landscape at once. To understand how Spinoza arrived at this nuanced hierarchy, we must look to two moments in his life that illuminate his intellectual journey. The first is an exchange of letters that began in the spring of 1665, when the young Dutch scholar Henry Oldenburg, the first secretary of the Royal Society in London, wrote to Spinoza asking about the nature of knowledge and the role of mathematics in philosophy. Oldenburg, a correspondent of Descartes and a conduit for the latest scientific discoveries, posed the question, do you think that the mind can attain certainty without the aid of geometrical demonstration? Spinoza's reply, preserved in the Philosophical Letters, is both concise and revealing. He wrote, the imagination may give us a notion of the particular, but it is the ratio that furnishes the universal, and only the intuition can bring us to the essence of the infinite. He went on to explain that the mind, like a craftsman, must first learn the tools of geometry before it can appreciate the deeper structures that those tools reveal. This correspondence shows that Spinoza saw the development of reason as a necessary step toward intuition, and that he placed mathematics at the heart of his epistemology, not merely as a convenient example, but as a model for all true knowledge. The second anecdote takes us into the private study of Spinoza's modest home in The Hague, where, according to the memoirs of his close friend and fellow philosopher Lodewijk Meyer, Spinoza kept a battered copy of Euclid's Elements on a simple wooden desk. Meyer recounts that Spinoza would spend long evenings, candlelight trembling, tracing the lines of a triangle with his finger, murmuring the propositions in a low, almost reverent tone. He would pause, close his eyes, and then speak aloud. Here the whole of geometry is contained, not in the particulars of the figure, but in the relations that bind them. This ritual of private study was more than a scholarly exercise. It was a disciplined practice of training the mind to move from the concrete to the abstract, to sharpen the faculty of reason until it could be used as a stepping stone toward the higher intuition. The image of Spinoza, alone in his modest room, engaging in a silent dialogue with Euclid, underscores how his epistemology was rooted in lived experience, in the slow, patient work of aligning the mind with the universal order. Having set the stage, we can now turn to the challenges that have been raised against Spinoza's hierarchy of knowledge. The first major critique comes from the empiricist tradition, most famously articulated by John Locke in his essay concerning human understanding. Locke argues that the mind at birth is a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and that all ideas are derived from experience. He writes, there is not a single innate idea, but all our knowledge is the offspring of sensation and reflection. From Locke's perspective, Spinoza's claim to the existence of innate ideas, especially the intuitive grasp of God's essence, seems to overstep the bounds of what can be justified by experience. Locke would ask, how can we be certain that the mind possesses a faculty capable of directly apprehending the infinite, when all our evidence comes from the senses? Moreover, Locke's emphasis on the limits of human understanding, he insists that we can never know the true nature of substance beyond its modes, directly opposes Spinoza's confident assertion that intuitive knowledge reveals the essence of substance itself. In response, Spinoza would point to the insufficiency of the imagination, as he does in the Ethics. The imagination is not a reliable guide, for it is bound to the accidents of the world, while reason and intuition lift the mind beyond those accidents. Yet the empiricist objection remains potent. If all ideas are ultimately traceable to sensation, where does the intuitive knowledge arise? Is it not a form of rationalist speculation, a leap beyond the evidence that Locke would deem unwarranted? A second, equally powerful counterargument emerges from the Kantian critique of pure reason. Immanuel Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, argues that the human mind is structured by a set of a priori categories, such as causality, unity, and necessity, that shape all experience, but that these categories cannot be applied to the noumenal realm, the thing in itself, which lies beyond possible experience. Kant writes, reason, when it overreaches, falls into illusion, for it attempts to grasp the unconditioned. He would therefore question Spinoza's claim that intuitive knowledge can provide a direct, unmediated insight into the essence of God, an infinite substance that, by Kant's lights, belongs to the noumenal. Kant would argue that any claim to such knowledge is a transcendental illusion, a misuse of reason that tries to step beyond the limits of possible experience. In Kant's terms, Spinoza's intuitive knowledge collapses the distinction between phenomena and noumena, treating the infinite as if it were an object of empirical cognition. The Kantian objection forces us to ask whether Spinoza's intuitive knowledge is truly a knowledge of the thing in itself, or whether it is a sophisticated form of rational imagination that, while powerful, still operates within the bounds of human cognition. These critiques do not necessarily invalidate Spinoza's project, but they do highlight the tension between his rationalist confidence and the epistemic modesty advocated by empiricists and critical philosophers. To navigate this tension, contemporary cognitive science offers an intriguing bridge. Modern research on pattern recognition and predictive coding suggests that the brain constantly constructs hierarchical models of the world, moving from low-level sensory inputs to high-level abstract representations. Neuroscientists describe this process as a cascade from fast, feed-forward perception analogous to Spinoza's imagination, to slow, recurrent reasoning that integrates information across multiple domains, resembling the ratio. Recent studies on insight problem solving reveal moments when the brain experiences a sudden reorganization of its model, an aha moment that aligns closely with Spinoza's intuitive knowledge. In a paper on the neural correlates of insight, researchers note that the anterior cingulate cortex and the default mode network become active when a solution emerges not from step-by-step deduction, but from a holistic restructuring of the problem space. This neurocognitive pattern mirrors Spinoza's claim that intuitive knowledge is a direct grasp of the essence, a sudden illumination that bypasses the incremental steps of reason. While cognitive science does not affirm the metaphysical claim that intuition reveals the infinite substance, it does provide a naturalistic account of how the mind can achieve a higher order, integrative understanding that feels, subjectively, like a glimpse of something beyond the mere sum of its parts. Returning to the rationalist lineage, we see that Spinoza's epistemology is a continuation and refinement of the ideas first articulated by René Descartes and later expanded by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Descartes, in his Meditations, famously distinguished between clear and distinct ideas, those grasped by the intellect alone, and the confused ideas that arise from the senses. He wrote, "I think, therefore I am," establishing the certainty of the thinking self as the foundation for all knowledge. Spinoza inherits this emphasis on clear, rational ideas, but he pushes further by insisting that the highest form of clarity is not merely logical consistency, but an identification with the very substance that underlies all modes. Leibniz, for his part, introduced the notion of monads, simple substances that reflect the universe from within, and argued that true knowledge arises from the pre-established harmony of these monads. Spinoza's substance, however, is not a collection of individual monads, but a single, infinite, self-caused entity. Yet both Leibniz and Spinoza's intuition share a commitment to the idea that the mind can, in principle, apprehend the whole through an inner, rational illumination. In this sense, Spinoza's intuitive knowledge can be read as a radicalization of Leibniz's intuitive perception of the truth, a move from the partial harmony of monads to the full, indivisible unity of substance. Let us now revisit the three illustrative cases, this time with a more detailed narrative that shows how each mode of knowledge operates in practice. Imagine a farmer walking through his fields at dawn. He sees a tree, its branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. The farmer's imagination registers the shape, the color, the rustle, and he forms a mental image. There is a tree. He can use this image to avoid stepping on a low branch or to remember where to plant a new crop. Yet his knowledge is limited. If the tree were to lose its leaves in winter, the same image would no longer apply and the farmer might be misled. The imagination, in Spinoza's terms, is the first kind of knowledge, the opinion, which is not adequate. It is useful, but it does not capture the essential nature of the tree as a mode of the underlying substance. Later that day, the farmer meets a traveling scholar who carries a wooden ruler and a piece of charcoal. The scholar draws a triangle on the ground and begins to explain why the sum of its interior angles must be 2 right angles. He points to the base, then to the two sides, then to the parallel line he extends beyond the triangle, demonstrating how alternate interior angles are equal. The farmer watches the steps, follows the logical chain, and sees that the conclusion does not depend on any particular tree, nor on any particular piece of chalk. It is a universal truth, true in any possible world where Euclidean geometry holds. Here the farmer experiences the ratio, the rational faculty that lifts him from the particular to the universal. The scholar's proof provides an adequate idea of the triangle, one that is true because it reflects the necessary relations among lines, not because it merely mirrors a specific drawing. Finally, imagine that same farmer, now older, sitting in quiet contemplation under the very tree he once saw. He reflects on the cycles of seasons, the growth of the tree, the way its roots draw nourishment from the earth, the way its leaves capture sunlight and transform it into life. In a moment of deep stillness, he feels an overwhelming sense that the tree is not an isolated object, but a manifestation of something far larger, a living expression of the same force that animates the soil, the water, the sky. He does not need to count angles or trace lines. The insight arrives as a single, luminous vision. The tree is an expression of the infinite order of nature, of the same substance that underlies his own breath. This is the intuitive knowledge that Spinoza describes, the scientia intuitiva, where the mind perceives the essence of the thing and recognizes that this essence is contained in its own essence. The farmer's experience, while personal, mirrors the philosophical claim that intuitive knowledge is a direct, immediate grasp of the unity of substance, a knowledge that is the most certain, for it proceeds from the very nature of the mind itself. These three scenes, taken together, illustrate how Spinoza's epistemology maps onto everyday life, academic practice, and mystical insight. They also show why Spinoza places such a high value on moving beyond the imagination. He writes, "The more the mind understands the true nature of things, the more it loves them, and the more it loves God, the more it is blessed." In other words, the ascent from imagination to reason to intuition is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is a moral and spiritual journey that transforms the knower. The historical context of Spinoza's thought deepens our appreciation of his epistemology. In the mid-17th century, the scientific revolution was reshaping the way people understood the world. The invention of the telescope and the publication of Kepler's Astronomia Nova demonstrated that celestial bodies could be described by mathematical laws. Yet the philosophical climate was still dominated by scholastic Aristotelianism, which held that knowledge began with sensory experience and was refined through syllogistic reasoning. Spinoza, raised in a Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, was exposed to both the rationalist currents of Descartes and the emerging empirical methods of the Royal Society. His correspondence with Henry Oldenburg, the first editor of the Philosophical Transactions, placed him at the crossroads of these intellectual streams. Oldenburg's question about the role of geometry was not merely a curiosity. It reflected a broader debate about whether the new science could provide a foundation for true knowledge, or whether it was limited to mere calculation. Spinoza's answer, emphasizing the necessity of reason and the possibility of intuition, positioned him as a bridge between the mechanistic mathematics of the new science and the metaphysical aspirations of the rationalist tradition. Spinoza's private study of Euclid, as recounted by Lodewijk Mayer, also reveals his methodological discipline. Mayer notes that Spinoza would often re-derive Euclid's propositions from first principles, not content to accept them at face value. He would ask, what is the definition of a point? What is the nature of a line? By interrogating the foundations, Spinoza trained his mind to move from the apparent to the essential, a habit that later allowed him to formulate the intuitive grasp of substance. This habit of re-deriving is reminiscent of the modern practice of proof-checking in mathematics and computer science, where each step is verified for logical soundness. Spinoza's devotion to Euclid thus becomes a concrete illustration of how the ratio can be cultivated, how the mind can be trained to see the necessary connections that underlie apparent phenomena. Now let us turn to the empiricist critique in more detail. Locke, writing a generation after Spinoza, insisted that the mind's ideas are either simple sensations, colors, sounds, textures, or reflections upon those sensations, such as the ideas of causation or identity. He denied the existence of innate ideas, claiming that any notion of God or substance must be built up from sensory experience. Locke writes, all our ideas are derived from either sensation or reflection. There is no other source. For Locke, the intuitive knowledge that Spinoza attributes to the mind would have to be explained as a particularly sophisticated reflection on sensory data, not as a direct apprehension of the infinite. Moreover, Locke's 14th book of the essay argues that even the idea of God is a complex idea, formed by combining simpler ideas of power, wisdom, and benevolence, each of which is itself derived from experience. In this view, Spinoza's claim that intuitive knowledge reveals the essence of God seems to presuppose an innate capacity that Locke would reject. The empiricist would ask, how can we be sure that the intuitive insight is not simply a projection of our own desires onto the world? This critique underscores the epistemic humility that Locke champions, a humility that stands in stark contrast to Spinoza's confident proclamation that the mind, properly guided, can achieve a direct, unmediated knowledge of the infinite. Kant's critique adds another layer of complexity. While Kant agrees with the rationalists that the mind contributes the forms of intuition, space and time, and the categories that structure experience, he draws a hard line at the claim that we can know the noumenal, the thing in itself. In the critique, Kant writes, the understanding cannot cognize the thing in itself, it can only cognize the phenomenon as it appears to us. If Spinoza's intuitive knowledge is indeed a direct grasp of God's essence, then it would be a knowledge of the noumenal, which Kant says is impossible. Kant also argues that reason, when it tries to go beyond possible experience, generates antinomies, contradictory conclusions that reveal the limits of pure reason. The intuitive knowledge that Spinoza celebrates could be seen, from a Kantian perspective, as a form of rational illusion, a transcendental illusion, where the mind mistakenly believes it has accessed the unconditioned. Kant's solution is to restrict reason to the realm of moral law, where the idea of the summum bonum can guide action without claiming theoretical knowledge of the infinite. Thus, Kant offers a sober counterweight to Spinoza's optimism, reminding us that the very structure of human cognition may prevent us from ever attaining the kind of intuitive knowledge Spinoza envisions. In contemporary cognitive science, the debate takes on new dimensions. Researchers in the field of predictive processing argue that the brain constantly generates hypotheses about the world and then updates them based on incoming sensory data. This process can be seen as a perpetual movement from imagination, the brain's prior predictions, to reason, the updating of models through error correction, and in rare moments to insight, when a new model fits the data so well that it feels like an immediate, intuitive fit. A study by Cunios and Beeman, 2009, on insight problem solving shows that the aha moment is accompanied by a burst of gamma band activity, suggesting a sudden synchronization of distant brain regions. This neurophysiological signature aligns strikingly with Spinoza's description of intuitive knowledge as a direct grasp that bypasses the step-by-step reasoning of the ratio. While modern neuroscience does not claim that such moments reveal the essence of the infinite, it does provide a plausible mechanism for how the mind can achieve a higher order, integrative understanding that feels, subjectively, like a glimpse of something beyond the ordinary. The rationalist tradition also offers valuable comparative insights. Descartes, in his Principles of Philosophy, argues that clear and distinct ideas are the foundation of knowledge, and he famously declares, "I think, therefore I am," as the indubitable starting point. Descartes' method of doubt, however, stops short of claiming that we can intuit the essence of God. He acknowledges that the idea of an infinite substance is innate, yet he maintains that we cannot fully comprehend it. Leibniz, on the other hand, develops a more elaborate system of monads and pre-established harmony, suggesting that each monad contains within it a complete representation of the universe. For Leibniz, the highest knowledge is the intuitive perception of the truth, a direct, internal awareness of the whole. Spinoza's intuitive knowledge can be seen as a synthesis. He accepts the rationalist claim that the mind can, in principle, grasp universal truths, but he rejects the dualistic metaphysics of Descartes and the pluralistic monads of Leibniz, uniting them in a single substance that is both the object and the subject of intuition. In doing so, Spinoza extends the rationalist project, proposing that the mind, when properly aligned, can see itself as a mode of the infinite substance, thereby achieving a unity that both Descartes and Leibniz could not fully articulate. To bring these threads together, let us consider a concrete, modern example that illustrates the three kinds of knowledge in a single domain: the study of climate change. A layperson hearing a news report about rising temperatures forms an imaginative impression. It's getting hotter, maybe it will be hotter next summer. This impression is based on isolated observations, perhaps a hotter day last week, and it is susceptible to misinterpretation. Perhaps the heat wave was an anomaly. The imagination here provides a useful but inadequate picture. A climate scientist, by contrast, employs the ratio. She builds models, uses differential equations, tests hypotheses against data, and derives predictions about sea level rise. Her conclusions are grounded in universal laws of physics, such as the Stefan-Boltzmann law, and are therefore more reliable. Finally, an intuitive grasp may arise for a policymaker or an activist who, after years of study and reflection, experiences a profound sense that the climate crisis is not merely a collection of data points, but a manifestation of a deeper, systemic imbalance in the relationship between humanity and nature. This intuitive insight can motivate decisive action, a moral urgency that goes beyond calculations. In this way, the three modes of knowledge interact. Imagination alerts us to a problem, reason supplies the evidence and the systematic understanding, and intuition provides the ethical impetus to act. Another example can be found in the realm of mathematics itself. A student first encounters the number pi as a decimal approximation, 3.14159, perhaps scribbled on a worksheet. This is an imaginative grasp, a concrete representation that is useful for calculations, but does not convey the deeper nature of pi as an irrational, transcendental number. As the student progresses, they learn the proof that pi is irrational, perhaps through a proof by contradiction using the properties of infinite series. This rational knowledge demonstrates the necessity of pi's non-terminating nature, showing that it cannot be expressed as a ratio of integers. Finally, a mathematician working in complex analysis may experience an intuitive insight into the geometric meaning of pi as the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, not merely as a number, but as a fundamental link between linear and circular measures, a bridge between Euclidean geometry and the complex plane. This intuition can lead to the discovery of Euler's identity, E pi plus 1 equals 0, a formula that unites 5 of mathematics' most important constants in a single, elegant expression. The intuitive leap here is not a stepwise deduction, but a holistic recognition of deep structural harmony, echoing Spinoza's claim that intuitive knowledge reveals the essence of the thing. In sum, Spinoza's threefold epistemology offers a rich framework for understanding how we move from the shadows of perception to the illumination of insight. The imagination provides the raw material, the reason organizes it into universal structures, and intuitive knowledge offers a direct, transformative vision of the underlying substance. The historical anecdotes of Spinoza's correspondence with Oldenburg and his private study of Euclid illustrate how these modes were cultivated in his own life, while the counterarguments from Locke and Kant remind us that the project is contested, that the limits of human cognition remain a central philosophical concern. Contemporary cognitive science, with its models of predictive coding and insight, provides empirical support for the plausibility of a hierarchical process that resembles Spinoza's ladder. And the rationalist tradition, from Descartes to Leibniz, situates Spinoza within a broader conversation about the capacity of reason to reach beyond the particular. When we reflect on Spinoza's vision, we are invited to ask ourselves, how often do we rely solely on imagination, mistaking the flickering images of the mind for reality? How frequently do we engage reason, constructing logical bridges that allow us to see the world in its necessary relations? And perhaps most importantly, how often do we allow ourselves the quiet space in which intuition can arise, that moment when the mind perceives the essence of the whole, and in doing so, recognizes its own place within that whole? Spinoza would answer that the path is open to all who are willing to cultivate their minds, to move from the fragmented to the unified, from the particular to the universal, and finally, to the intuitive. As he concludes in the Ethics, the more we understand, the more we love, and the more we love, the more we are blessed. In the calm, reflective rhythm of this exploration, we may find, as Spinoza suggests, a guide not only for philosophy, but for the very way we live our lives. Imagine for a moment that the universe is a single, infinite tapestry of cause and effect, each thread woven so tightly that to tug on one is to feel the movement of the whole. This is the picture Baruch Spinoza offers in the second part of his masterwork, the Ethics. He does not speak of a world where free will flickers like a candle in a gust of wind. Instead, he paints a vision of determinism so thorough that every thought, every action, every emotion is the necessary expression of a single, all-encompassing substance. Yet paradoxically, within this deterministic framework, Spinoza discovers a kind of freedom not of arbitrary choice, but of understanding the necessity that governs us. In part II of the Ethics, Spinoza begins by establishing his metaphysical foundation. There exists only one substance, which he calls God or nature, Deus sive Natura. From this single substance flow an infinite number of attributes, each expressing the essence of the whole. Human beings, he argues, are modes of the attribute of extension and of the attribute of thought. Because we are modes, we are determined by the same chain of cause and effect that governs everything else. there is no room for a free will that stands apart from the causal order. As he writes, the will is not a free power, but a function of the intellect, and therefore of the same nature as the intellect. Ethics, Part II, Proposition 31, Scholium. The will, then, is simply the conscious awareness of the desire that moves us. But Spinoza does not stop at a bleak determinism that would render morality meaningless. He introduces the principle of conatus, the innate striving of each thing to persist in its own being. In Latin, he calls it conatus. In English, we speak of the striving to persevere. Every individual, from the tiniest particle to the most complex mind, is driven by this fundamental impulse. For humans, conatus manifests as the desire to increase our power of acting, what Spinoza calls potentia. Our ethical life, therefore, becomes the cultivation of that power in a way that aligns us with the rational order of nature. When we speak of freedom in Spinoza's terms, we must shift the focus from the ability to choose otherwise to the capacity to understand why we act as we do. In Proposition 45 of Part III, Spinoza declares, the more we understand the necessary causes of our emotions, the more we become free. Freedom, for him, is the intellectual love of God, amor intellectualis Dei, the joy that arises when we see the world through the lens of necessity, when we recognize that the passions that once seemed to dominate us are in fact expressions of the same deterministic chain that we can comprehend, and through that comprehension, transform. To bring this abstract architecture into the concrete, let us consider a modern habit formation loop, a phenomenon that behavioral economists describe in terms of cue, routine, and reward. Imagine a person who reaches for a smartphone each morning the moment the alarm sounds. The cue is the alarm, the routine is the scrolling, the reward is the dopamine hit of novelty. According to Spinoza, this loop is a manifestation of conatus. The individual strives to preserve and enhance their sense of self, and the habit becomes a mode that serves that striving. Yet if the person becomes aware, through reflective thought, of the causal chain that binds the cue to the routine and the reward, they can intervene. By understanding the necessity of the habit, they gain a kind of freedom. The ability to re-engineer the loop, perhaps replacing scrolling with meditation. In Spinoza's language, the mind moves from passive passio to active actio, from being driven by external causes to being guided by the knowledge of those causes. The habit is no longer an invisible master, it becomes a transparent mechanism that can be reshaped. A second, more societal example lies in the realm of political liberty within a pluralistic community. Spinoza's Theologico-Politicus of 1670 sparked fierce debate about the limits of freedom of thought. He argued that the state should protect the freedom to think and speak, not because a sovereign can guarantee divine truth, but because such liberty promotes the collective rational self-interest of citizens. In a diverse society, each individual's conatus seeks self-preservation, but when rational understanding is cultivated, the pursuit of self-interest aligns with the common good. The political freedom to debate, to dissent, to argue, is therefore a manifestation of the same principle that governs personal freedom. The more citizens understand the necessity of laws, the more they can act freely within that framework. This is not a libertarian fantasy of unbounded choice. It is a rational coordination of many conatuses, each guided by the knowledge of the social determinants that shape them. The historical anecdote of the 1670 debate over Theologico-Politicus provides a vivid illustration of this principle in action. When the work first circulated, it encountered fierce opposition from both the religious establishment and the Dutch authorities, who feared that Spinoza's call for freedom of thought would erode social cohesion. Yet Spinoza, in a letter to his friend Henry Oldenburg, defended his position by asserting that the true liberty of the mind is the liberty to use reason. The controversy forced the public to confront the question: can a society that tolerates rational discourse truly be free? The eventual acceptance of Spinoza's ideas in the Dutch Republic, albeit gradual, demonstrated that when a community acknowledges the deterministic forces, economic pressures, religious dogma, political power, that shape thought, it can choose to restructure those forces in a way that maximizes collective rational power. In this sense, the historical episode becomes a case study of Spinoza's claim that freedom is the understanding of necessity, applied at the level of a polity. Another pivotal moment in Spinoza's intellectual trajectory occurred in 1675, when he drafted the Tractatus de Intellectus Emendation, the treatise on the emendation of the intellect. Though the manuscript remained unpublished in his lifetime, its ideas seeped into the early Enlightenment through the correspondence of scholars such as Henry Oldenburg, and later through the writings of Pierre Bayle and John Locke. The treatise emphasized the need to correct the intellect by stripping away inadequate ideas, a process Spinoza called adequatio. This method of intellectual self-purification resonated with the burgeoning rationalist movement, influencing thinkers who championed the autonomy of reason against the tyranny of tradition. The Tractatus illustrates how Spinoza's ethical project, freedom through understanding, found fertile ground beyond his own writings, shaping the very climate that would later give rise to modern secular democracies. It also foreshadows contemporary discussions in cognitive neuroscience about psychological freedom, the capacity to recognize and modulate the automatic processes that drive behavior. Now let us turn to the objections that have risen against Spinoza's deterministic optimism. The first comes from the existentialist tradition, most famously articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre famously declared, "Existence precedes essence," insisting that humans are condemned to be free, that we must create our own values in the face of an absurd universe. From Sartre's perspective, Spinoza's notion that freedom is merely the intellectual grasp of necessity seems to deny the radical, anguished freedom that defines human existence. Sartre would argue that Spinoza reduces freedom to a kind of intellectual complacency, a quiet acceptance of the chains that bind us, rather than an authentic act of rebellion against them. He writes in Being and Nothingness that man is nothing else than what he makes of himself, emphasizing that we are not determined by any pre-existing nature but by our choices. In confronting this claim, we must ask, does Spinoza's freedom truly eliminate agency, or does it simply reframe agency as an activity of the intellect? If we accept that our conatus is the drive to persist and that understanding this drive amplifies our power, then Sartre's radical freedom becomes a special case of Spinoza's broader principle, one where the individual, by recognizing the necessity of his own finitude, can still affirm his own project. Yet the tension remains, and it pushes us to refine what we mean by freedom. Is it the capacity to choose otherwise, or the capacity to choose wisely, informed by the knowledge of why we are the way we are? The second objection arises from theological quarters that accuse Spinoza of annihilating personal providence. By equating God with nature, Spinoza denies a transcendent deity who intervenes in human affairs, who grants grace, who answers prayers. Critics claim that this pantheistic view reduces God to a blind, indifferent mechanism, stripping the world of moral purpose. In the Theologico Politicus, Spinoza writes, "The more we understand God, the more we see that God is not a man, but the whole of nature." For believers who hold that God's providence is personal, this is a direct challenge. They argue that without a personal God, morality loses its anchor, and the promise of redemption becomes hollow. Yet, Spinoza would respond that the love of God is precisely the love of the rational order that sustains us. He replaces personal providence with the idea that understanding the necessary causes of our existence is itself a form of divine love, a love that is universal, not selective. Moreover, the ethical system he proposes does not depend on divine command, but on the natural inclination of each being to seek its own preservation. In this sense, the moral law emerges from the very structure of reality, not from an external command. The theological objection forces us to consider whether morality requires a personal deity, or whether it can be grounded in the very fabric of existence, as Spinoza suggests. To deepen our appreciation of Spinoza's ethical landscape, it helps to cross-reference his ideas with contemporary virtue ethics. Modern virtue theorists such as Philippa Foot and Alasdair MacIntyre emphasize the cultivation of character traits that enable human flourishing. While they speak in terms of virtues like courage, temperance, and justice, Spinoza's potentia and conatus echo a similar concern, the development of a stable, rational self that can navigate the deterministic currents of life. Where virtue ethics asks, "What kind of person should I be?" Spinoza asks, "How can I increase my power of acting in accordance with reason?" Both approaches converge on the notion that ethical life is a matter of self-formation, not of adherence to external rules. In fact, Spinoza's ethics can be read as an early prototype of virtue ethics, one that grounds the good life not in a set of prescribed duties, but in the progressive enhancement of our rational capacities. Behavioral economics, too, offers a fertile dialogue with Spinoza's conatus. Daniel Kahneman's distinction between System 1, fast, automatic, and System 2, slow, deliberative, mirrors Spinoza's division between passive passio and active actio. The habit formation example we explored earlier aligns with the idea that much of our behavior is driven by automatic processes, what Spinoza would call the passive modes of the mind. Yet when we engage System 2, we exercise the active intellect, the very faculty that Spinoza holds to be the source of freedom. The modern concept of nudging, designing environments that subtly guide choices, can be seen as a practical application of Spinoza's insight. By shaping the external determinants that feed into our conatus, we can promote choices that enhance collective well-being. In this light, Spinoza's ethics anticipate a sophisticated understanding of human behavior that only centuries later would be formalized in the language of economics. Neuroscience adds yet another layer to the conversation, especially when we consider the notion of psychological freedom. Studies of the prefrontal cortex reveal that the capacity to inhibit impulsive responses, what researchers call executive control, is correlated with the ability to reflect on one's own motivations. This reflective capacity is precisely what Spinoza describes as the transition from passio to actio. When a person becomes aware that a craving for sugar is the result of a cascade of hormonal signals, they can choose, through the exercise of reason, to replace the sugary snack with a healthier alternative. In this sense, the brain's ability to model its own processes mirrors Spinoza's claim that freedom is the knowledge of necessity. The neuroscientific finding that our sense of agency arises after we have already begun a motor action underscores his point. We often feel free after the deterministic chain has set the motion, but the feeling of freedom is itself a product of the mind's interpretive function. The modern term metacognition is the scientific counterpart of Spinoza's intellectus. Returning to the ethics itself, let us trace the logical progression from part II through part V in part III. Spinoza moves from the metaphysical to the psychological, showing how the mind's ideas are either adequate or inadequate. Adequate ideas correspond to true knowledge of the necessary causes. Inadequate ideas are partial, leading to passions that enslave us. He famously declares, "The more we understand, the more we are free. The more we are free, the more we understand." This circular reinforcement is the engine of his ethical project. In part IV, he examines the nature of human bondage, describing how the passions, joy, sadness, desire, arise from inadequate ideas and bind us to the deterministic flow. Yet even within bondage, there is a path to liberation, the transformation of passive emotions into active ones through the cultivation of adequate ideas. He writes, "The mind, being affected by the same causes as the body, can be freed from the bondage of the passions by the knowledge of the causes of those passions." This is the moment where the abstract notion of conatus becomes a lived practice. We learn to align our striving with the rational order, thereby increasing our power of acting. Part V culminates in the discussion of blessedness, or beatitudo, which Spinoza identifies with the intellectual love of God. This love is not an emotional devotion to a deity, but a rational appreciation of the necessary structure of reality. It is the highest form of freedom, because it is a joy that cannot be diminished by external circumstances. It is rooted in the very nature of existence. He says, "The more we understand God, the more we love Him, and the more we love Him, the more we are blessed." In a world that often equates happiness with fleeting pleasures, Spinoza offers a radical redefinition. True happiness is the serene acceptance of necessity, coupled with the active enhancement of our rational capacities. To see how this plays out in contemporary life, consider the movement towards sustainable living. Individuals who adopt a lifestyle that reduces carbon footprints often do so not merely out of altruistic sentiment, but because they recognize the deterministic link between personal consumption, climate change, and the survival of future generations. Their conatus, striving to preserve their own being, extends to the broader network of life that sustains them. By understanding the causal chain that connects a single choice, say, biking instead of driving, to the health of the planet, they experience a form of freedom. They are no longer passive victims of an impersonal system, but active participants shaping the deterministic flow toward a more stable future. This example mirrors Spinoza's claim that freedom is the knowledge of necessity applied to the collective sphere. In political terms, the idea of rational self-interest guiding pluralistic societies resonates with contemporary liberal democracies that emphasize deliberative discourse. The philosopher Eugen Habermas, for instance, argues that the legitimacy of law arises from the rational communication of free and equal participants. Spinoza anticipates this by insisting that the state must protect the freedom to think, because only through the free exchange of ideas can citizens develop the adequate ideas necessary for true liberty. The modern practice of open-source governance, where citizens can view, critique, and amend policies online, can be seen as a digital embodiment of Spinoza's vision. A platform that nurtures the intellectual empowerment of individuals, thereby enhancing the collective potentia. Yet, the challenges remain. Critics of Spinoza's deterministic optimism point to the persistence of irrationality, prejudice, and addiction. If everything is determined, why do some societies seem more free than others? Why do certain individuals break through the deterministic chain and achieve profound moral insight, while others remain mired in vice? Spinoza would answer that the variance lies in the degree to which individuals have cultivated adequate ideas. The more one studies, reflects, and aligns one's desires with reason, the more one's conatus is guided toward genuine power. The less one does, the more one remains enslaved to passive emotions. This is not a deterministic fatalism that condemns all to the same fate. It is a gradient of freedom, measured by the clarity of understanding. Sartre's existentialist critique pushes us further. If we are determined, can we still be held morally responsible? Spinoza's reply is embedded in his notion of necessity as a source of moral evaluation. He argues that we can praise or blame actions not because they could have been otherwise, but because they reflect the degree to which the agent acted from adequate ideas. A person who harms another out of ignorance is less blameworthy than one who harms out of a conscious, rational decision to do so. Moral responsibility, therefore, becomes a matter of self-knowledge rather than free will. This reframing offers a nuanced way to address accountability without invoking an illusory libertarian freedom. The theological objection, too, can be softened by recognizing that Spinoza does not deny moral order. He simply locates it within the fabric of nature. The ancient Stoics, who also identified God with the rational order of the cosmos, offered a similar answer. Virtue is living in accordance with nature. Spinoza's ethics can be read as a modern Stoicism, one that replaces the providential gods of antiquity with a pantheistic rationality. The comfort that believers find in personal providence may be reinterpreted as the comfort of understanding. Knowing that the world operates according to intelligible laws can provide a sense of security comparable to that offered by divine providence. Let us pause now to reflect on the language Spinoza uses. In Proposition 29 of Part II, he writes, "The intellect, insofar as it perceives the necessary order of nature, is a part of eternity." This poetic phrasing captures the timeless quality of true understanding. When we grasp the necessity of our actions, we step out of the fleeting moment of desire and glimpse the eternal structure that underlies it. This glimpse is the source of the intellectual love of God, a love that is not sentimental but rational, not dependent on miracles but on the clarity of insight. It is a love that can be cultivated through study, meditation, and the disciplined examination of one's own mental processes. In practice, cultivating this love involves a series of habits that echo the modern concept of mindfulness. By paying attention to the arising of thoughts and emotions without immediate reaction, we begin to trace the chain of causes that give rise to them. This reflective pause is the moment where passio can become actio. In the language of neuroscience, we are strengthening the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, enhancing our capacity for self-regulation. In Spinoza's terms, we are increasing the adequacy of our ideas, thereby expanding our potentia. The everyday practice of journaling, for example, can serve as a concrete tool. By recording the circumstances that trigger a particular desire, we externalize the causal chain, making it visible and thus susceptible to rational analysis. Consider another historical vignette. The correspondence between Spinoza and the Dutch merchant and philosopher, Henry Oldenburg, who later became the first secretary of the Royal Society. In a 1675 letter, Oldenburg praised Spinoza's Tractatus for its method of clearing the mind of false notions. Oldenburg's own work in disseminating scientific findings across Europe reflects the very spirit of Spinoza's call for intellectual freedom. The spread of ideas about the heliocentric model, the laws of motion, and the chemical nature of substances, all of which challenged entrenched religious doctrines, mirrored Spinoza's belief that the more people understood the necessary order of nature, the freer they would become. This cross-pollination of scientific and philosophical thought illustrates how Spinoza's ethics were not confined to abstract speculation, but were actively shaping the intellectual climate that gave rise to the Enlightenment. In the present day, we can see Spinoza's influence in the burgeoning field of behavioral public policy. Governments that employ evidence-based interventions, such as default enrollment in retirement savings plans, are applying the insight that people's choices are heavily swayed by the architecture of options. By designing policies that align with the deterministic tendencies of human behavior, policymakers aim to expand citizens' potentia without coercion, thereby respecting the Spinozist ideal of freedom through understanding. This approach also resonates with the virtue-ethical emphasis on fostering environments that encourage the development of good character, rather than merely imposing external constraints. To To bring the discussion full circle, let us revisit the central claim. Freedom, for Spinoza, is not the whimsical ability to will otherwise, but the rational comprehension of why we will as we do. It is the intellectual love of the necessary order that transforms the passive conatus into an active, empowered striving. This conception invites us to see our habits, our political institutions, our moral judgments, and even our neural processes as parts of a larger tapestry, each thread intelligible through reason. When we pull at a thread, when we examine a habit or a law, we do not unravel the whole. We see how the pattern holds together, and we can adjust the design with purpose. In the quiet moments of reflection, perhaps you have felt the tension between the feeling of being compelled by forces beyond your control and the sense of agency that arises when you understand those forces. Spinoza would say that the latter moment is the true experience of freedom. He would invite you to continue the inquiry, to trace each desire back to its cause, to replace inadequate ideas with adequate ones, and to let the intellectual love of God, of the rational order, guide your actions. In doing so, you align your conatus with the infinite power of nature, and you step into the blessedness that Spinoza describes as the highest good. So, as we close this exploration of Spinoza's ethics, of determinism, conatus, and the good life, remember that the journey does not end with understanding the text. It continues in the everyday choices you make, the habits you reshape, the dialogues you engage in within your community, and the moments you pause to reflect on why you think and act as you do. In each of those moments, you are participating in the very process Spinoza envisioned, the gradual, rational emancipation of the human mind from the shackles of ignorance, and the blossoming of a freedom that is as deep as it is serene. When we turn to the Theologico-Politicus, we encounter perhaps the most daring synthesis of political theory and religious criticism ever to emerge from the 17th century Republic of the Netherlands. Spinoza writes not merely as a philosopher, but as a citizen who has watched the streets of Amsterdam swell with merchants, refugees, and dissenters, all seeking a place where the mind might be free to inquire. He asks us, gently yet insistently, what sort of state can truly protect that freedom. The answer he offers is a secular democracy, a polity in which the powers of the state are distinct from the powers of theology, and in which the right to free inquiry is guarded as a public good. Spinoza's central claim is that the state's ultimate aim is the preservation of peace and the flourishing of its citizens, not the enforcement of a particular religious doctrine. He writes, the end of the state is the preservation of the freedom of the people, and that freedom consists in the ability to act according to the laws of nature and reason. In other words, the legitimacy of political authority rests on its capacity to safeguard the rational capacities of its subjects, not on its claim to divine sanction. This is a radical departure from the prevailing view that the sovereign's power derived from God's will, a view that Hobbes, for instance, would defend by arguing that the sovereign's absolute authority is necessary to prevent the chaos of a state of nature. To understand why Spinoza makes this claim, we must first examine his critique of biblical literalism. He argues that the scriptures were never intended as a scientific treatise, but as a guide for moral conduct and communal cohesion. In the Theologico-Politicus he famously declares, "The Bible is not a book of philosophy, but a book of law and history, written for the people of the time, and not for the philosophers of eternity." By stripping the Bible of its claim to universal, timeless authority, Spinoza opens the door for the state to regulate religious practice without infringing upon the genuine moral teachings that can still inspire virtue. He insists that the true aim of religion is to promote ethical behavior, not to dictate political allegiance. Spinoza's vision of a tolerant republic is thus built on two pillars: the separation of theology from politics and the protection of free inquiry. He imagines a civic space where individuals may pursue their own interpretations of the divine, provided that such interpretations do not threaten public order. In his own words, the freedom to think, speak, and write about the divine must be preserved, for it is the very foundation of a stable and progressive society. This is not a call for anarchy of belief, but a measured invitation to let the market of ideas operate under the rule of law, much as the Dutch merchants allowed a diversity of trade practices to flourish under a common legal framework. The historical context of the Dutch Republic makes this vision all the more striking. By the mid-17th century, the United Provinces had already earned a reputation for religious tolerance that was unparalleled in Europe. The city of Amsterdam, in particular, welcomed Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal, Huguenots fleeing French persecution, and Anabaptists who found refuge from the strictures of the Reformed Church. The Dutch authorities, motivated by both pragmatic commerce and a genuine belief in civic peace, enacted policies that allowed these groups to worship in private, to run their own schools, and to participate fully in civic life. Spinoza's own family, of Portuguese Sephardic Jewish origin, benefited from this atmosphere of relative openness, even as they navigated the delicate balance between communal expectations and individual conscience. One vivid anecdote illustrates how Spinoza's ideas were disseminated under conditions of caution. In the summer of 1670, a modest pamphlet titled Tractatus Theologico-Politicus began to circulate clandestinely among the learned circles of Amsterdam. The manuscript was printed in a modest workshop in the Jordan district, and copies were passed hand to hand, often concealed within the folds of merchants' ledgers. Spinoza himself, aware of the danger of provoking the powerful Calvinist establishment, instructed his confidants to distribute the work quietly, warning that the truth, once it has been set free, must be guarded against those who would bind it with the cords of fear. This covert distribution not only testifies to the subversive power of his ideas, but also mirrors the very tolerance he advocates. A society in which ideas can spread, even if initially under the radar, without the state imposing outright bans. Another episode that underscores Spinoza's commitment to tolerance comes from his correspondence with Henry Oldenburg, the founding editor of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. In a letter dated early 1675, Oldenburg asked Spinoza about the feasibility of a state that would protect religious diversity while maintaining civic order. Spinoza replied, if a ruler wishes to secure the peace of his realm, he must allow the peoples of different faiths to speak their truths, for the suppression of speech breeds resentment, and resentment breeds rebellion. He went on to argue that the true test of a ruler's wisdom lies in his ability to mediate, not to coerce, the differing convictions of his subjects. This exchange, preserved in the archives of the Royal Society, reveals how Spinoza's ideas resonated beyond the Dutch borders, influencing the early Enlightenment discourse on religious liberty. Spinoza's arguments for secular democracy find a natural counterpart in the writings of John Locke, particularly in his letter concerning toleration. Locke, writing a few decades later, also separates the realm of civil government from the realm of religious belief, asserting that the care of souls belongs to God alone. Yet Locke's emphasis on the private nature of belief differs subtly from Spinoza's more public stance that the state must actively protect the right to discuss and publish theological ideas. Both philosophers, however, converge on the point that coercion in matters of conscience is both morally unjust and politically counterproductive. By cross-referencing Locke, we can see how Spinoza's Theologico-Politicus laid groundwork for a broader liberal tradition that later thinkers such as Rawls and Habermas would expand. In contemporary liberal theory, John Rawls's concept of public reason echoes Spinoza's insistence that political decisions be justified by reasons accessible to all citizens, regardless of their religious commitments. Rawls writes that in a well-ordered society, the state must appeal to shared political values rather than particular doctrinal claims. Spinoza anticipates this by demanding that the laws of the state be grounded in the common good and the rational nature of humanity. Likewise, Eugen Habermas's theory of the ideal speech situation presumes a public sphere where participants can freely exchange arguments without domination. Spinoza's protection of free inquiry can be read as an early articulation of this ideal, a realm where ideas, even sacred ones, are subject to rational debate in a climate of mutual respect. To bring these lofty ideas into the concrete realm of modern politics, consider the ongoing constitutional debates in several European countries over the display of religious symbols in public spaces. In France, the principle of laïcité has led to laws banning conspicuous religious attire in schools, while in Germany, courts have grappled with the permissibility of crucifixes in classrooms. These disputes echo Spinoza's central question: should the state endorse a particular religious symbol, thereby privileging one belief system over others, or should it adopt a neutral stance that protects the freedom of all citizens to practice, or not practice, religion as they see fit? Proponents of secularism often invoke Spinoza's claim that the state must not interfere with the private worship of its citizens, nor must it compel them to worship at all. While opponents sometimes argue that the removal of religious symbols erodes cultural heritage, a concern that Spinoza would likely address by reminding us that the true heritage of a republic lies in its commitment to reason and peace, not in the icons of any single faith. Yet Spinoza's proposals were not without fierce opposition. In 1672, a group of Orthodox Calvinist ministers drafted a document known as the Acta, condemning the Theologico-Politicus as heretical and dangerous. They argued that by separating theology from the state, Spinoza was undermining the divine order that gave legitimacy to civil authority. The Acta declared any attempt to detach the law of God from the law of the prince is an affront to both heaven and earth. This backlash illustrates the powerful forces that resisted the secularization of politics. Forces that Hobbes had anticipated when he defended the absolute sovereignty of the monarch as necessary to prevent the war of all against all. Hobbes, in his Leviathan, contended that the sovereign's power must be absolute, lest the multitude fall into discord. Spinoza, by contrast, argued that absolute power inevitably breeds tyranny, because a ruler who claims divine sanction cannot be held accountable to the rational standards that the citizens themselves uphold. The Hobbesian counterargument raises an important question. If the state's authority is limited, how can it ensure order? Spinoza answers by appealing to the social contract, not as a surrender of all power to a sovereign, but as an agreement among citizens to respect each other's freedom while collectively defending peace. He writes, the power of the state is derived from the collective will of the people, who consent to be governed insofar as the government protects their liberty to think and speak. In this view, the legitimacy of political power is conditional, subject to the ongoing consent of the governed, a notion that would later be echoed in Locke's theory of government by consent and in modern democratic practice. To illuminate Spinoza's reasoning, let us imagine an analogy of a garden. In a garden, each plant needs sunlight, water, and space to grow. If a gardener were to impose a single, rigid design, say, a single row of identical flowers, some plants would wither, and the garden would lose its diversity and resilience. Spinoza's secular republic is like a well-tended garden where multiple species coexist, each contributing its own beauty while adhering to the basic rules that prevent one plant from choking out the others. The state, like the gardener, sets the boundaries, protecting the soil, ensuring the water is shared, but does not dictate the exact shape of each flower. This metaphor captures the balance between order and freedom that Spinoza strives to articulate. Returning to the Dutch example, the early tolerance policies of the Republic were not merely theoretical. In 1619, the city of Amsterdam passed a decree allowing Jews to practice their faith openly, provided they paid taxes and obeyed civil law. This policy was not driven solely by humanitarian concern. It also recognized the economic benefits of a diverse, industrious population. Merchants of different faiths brought with them trade networks that spanned the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Levant. The resulting prosperity reinforced the pragmatic wisdom of tolerance. A tolerant state is a thriving state. Spinoza's philosophical justification dovetails with this historical reality, showing how a principled commitment to freedom can also yield tangible material benefits. In the modern arena, the debate over religious symbols often centers on the question of whether a secular state must be neutral or merely non-preferential. Spinoza would likely argue for neutrality, not as a denial of cultural expression, but as a safeguard that ensures no single confession can dominate the public sphere. He writes, the state must remain indifferent to the doctrines of the heavens, lest it become a tool of oppression for any particular creed. This principle can be seen in contemporary constitutional courts that strike down laws privileging one religion over others, thereby preserving a public space where citizens can engage as equals, regardless of belief. The Theologico-Politicus also contains a striking passage on the right to free inquiry that resonates with today's academic freedoms. Spinoza asserts, the freedom of thought is the foundation of all other freedoms. For without the liberty to examine, to question, and to argue, no other liberty can be genuine. He warns that censorship not only stifles individual growth, but also impedes the collective progress of society. This insight anticipates the modern understanding that scientific and philosophical advancement depends upon an environment where ideas can be challenged without fear of persecution. In universities across the world, debates over safe spaces and cancel culture often invoke the same tension Spinoza identified: how to protect the dignity of individuals while preserving the open exchange of ideas essential to truth. Spinoza's insistence on separating theology from politics also anticipates the modern concept of pluralism. He observes that the multitude is composed of many different minds, each with its own conception of the divine. By acknowledging this diversity, he rejects the notion that a single, monolithic religious truth can serve as the basis for law. Instead, he proposes that the state should adopt a set of universal principles, justice, peace, and the protection of rights, that are accessible to all, regardless of their theological commitments. This pluralistic framework is echoed in contemporary liberal democracies that recognize multiple faiths, as well as secular worldviews, within a single constitutional order. In addressing the religious orthodox backlash, we must remember that the Acta of 1672 was not merely a pamphlet. It was a coordinated effort involving university professors, clergy, and even members of the municipal council. They convened a series of public debates attempting to discredit Spinoza by labeling him a radical atheist and a danger to the social fabric. Their arguments hinged on the belief that without a state-endorsed theology, moral order would collapse. Spinoza, however, counters this claim by pointing to the stability of the Dutch Republic itself, a state that, despite its religious diversity, enjoyed relative peace and economic prosperity. He asks rhetorically, if the presence of many confessions does not breed chaos, why should we fear the removal of doctrinal authority from the public sphere? Hobbes, for his part, would respond that only a sovereign with unquestioned authority can guarantee peace, especially when citizens hold conflicting beliefs. He famously writes, "Covenants without the sword are but words." Spinoza's reply, implicit in his work, is that the sword of coercion is replaced by the sword of reason. A rational public discourse that can resolve conflicts without resorting to force. By fostering a culture of rational debate, the state can maintain order while respecting individual conscience. This exchange between Spinoza and Hobbes illustrates a fundamental tension that continues to animate political theory, the balance between authority and liberty. To bring these ideas into the everyday, consider the simple act of a public school teacher discussing the story of Noah's Ark. In a Spinozist republic, the teacher is free to present the narrative as a cultural myth, a literary work, or a theological truth, provided that the presentation does not incite hatred or disrupt public order. The state does not prohibit the discussion, nor does it endorse a particular interpretation. Instead, it ensures that the classroom remains a space where students can engage with the material critically, learning to distinguish between historical fact, moral lesson, and doctrinal claim. This educational model reflects Spinoza's broader aim, to cultivate citizens capable of rational thought, capable of participating in a democratic polity without resorting to dogma. The modern constitutional debates over religious symbols provide a vivid illustration of how Spinoza's ideas continue to speak across centuries. In the United States, the Supreme Court's decision in Town of Greece v. Galloway 2014 upheld the practice of opening town meetings with a prayer, emphasizing the tradition of legislative prayer as part of the nation's heritage. Critics, invoking Spinoza, argue that such practices risk blurring the line between state and religion, potentially alienating citizens of different faiths or none at all. Conversely, in Canada, the Supreme Court's ruling in Syndicat Northcrest v. Amselem, 2004, protected the right of individuals to erect a religious symbol on private property, highlighting the balance between personal religious expression and collective secular regulation. These cases reveal the ongoing negotiation between respecting religious identity and maintaining a neutral public sphere, a negotiation that Spinoza would frame as essential to the preservation of peace. Spinoza's vision also resonates with the contemporary discourse on the public reason advanced by John Rawls. Rawls argues that in a pluralistic society, political decisions must be justified by reasons that all citizens can accept, regardless of their comprehensive doctrines. Spinoza anticipates this by insisting that laws be grounded in the common good and the rational nature of humanity, not in any particular theological claim. He writes, "The law must be based upon the nature of men and not upon the will of the divine." In doing so, he provides a philosophical bridge from early modern tolerance to modern liberal constitutionalism. Habermas's concept of the ideal speech situation, wherein participants engage in discourse free from domination, also finds a precursor in Spinoza's call for free inquiry. The Theologico-Politicus insists that the state should protect the right to publish, to debate, and to criticize religious doctrines, because only through such open dialogue can truth emerge. Habermian scholars often cite Spinoza as an early forerunner of the communicative rationality that underpins contemporary democratic deliberation. The parallels are striking. Both thinkers view the public sphere as a space where reason, not power, should determine the legitimacy of norms. In reflecting upon Spinoza's arguments, we might ask ourselves, what would his Theologico-Politicus look like if written today? Perhaps he would address the digital age, where ideas spread at the speed of light, and where misinformation can threaten democratic stability. He would likely argue that the state's role is not to censor, but to ensure that the marketplace of ideas remains open and that citizens possess the rational tools to discern truth from falsehood. The core principle would remain unchanged. Protect the freedom to think, speak, and write, for this is the bedrock of a peaceful, prosperous republic. The legacy of Spinoza's secular democratic vision is evident not only in the philosophical canon, but also in concrete policy. The Dutch Republic's early tolerance policies, which allowed Jews, Protestants, and Catholics to coexist, set a precedent for modern pluralistic societies. The clandestine 1670 pamphlet, distributed in the shadows of Amsterdam's canals, demonstrated that ideas can survive even under threat, and that a society that tolerates dissent can ultimately flourish. The 1675 correspondence with Henry Oldenburg showed that the call for religious liberty was not confined to the Netherlands, but resonated across Europe's intellectual networks. Finally, we return to Spinoza's own words, which echo across the centuries. The more the mind is free from the yoke of superstition, the more it can attain the true happiness that comes from understanding the nature of God and the world. In a calm, reflective tone, we can hear his invitation to each of us to nurture a public sphere where reason and tolerance walk hand in hand, where the state protects the right to inquire, and where the diversity of belief becomes a source of strength rather than division. In embracing this vision, we honor not only Spinoza's philosophical genius, but also the enduring promise of a society that values both freedom and peace. When we look back from the bright corridors of contemporary thought to the quiet 17th century study where Baruch Spinoza first set down his system, it is tempting to think of his philosophy as a relic, a curious footnote in the history of ideas. Yet the reality is far more vibrant. Spinoza's monism, his ethics of rational love of what he calls God or nature, and his daring identification of mind and body have reverberated across centuries, shaping the Enlightenment, echoing through German idealism, finding fresh expression in Romantic poetry, and resurfacing with renewed vigor in the scientific and ecological discourses of today. In this segment, we will trace that winding line of influence, pause at the most illuminating moments, and consider how Spinoza's thought is being taken up, and sometimes challenged, in the work of physicists, philosophers of process, environmental activists, and neuroscientists. The first major ripple of Spinoza's impact was felt in the intellectual ferment of the 18th century, when the very notion of a rational, deterministic universe began to replace the older, providential view of a world governed by a personal, interventionist deity. German philosophers such as Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Gottlieb Fichte found in Spinoza a model for a philosophy that could unite nature and freedom. Herder, in his Ideas for the Philosophy of History of Humanity, praised Spinoza for daring to see the world as a single, living whole, a sentiment that resonated with the romantic ideal of the unity of the individual and the cosmos. Fichte, while developing his own absolute I, nonetheless acknowledged Spinoza's clear, unshakable demonstration that the world is a necessary expression of a single substance. The German idealists, especially Hegel, would later rework Spinoza's monism into a dialectical process, but the seed was already planted. Reality is a single, self-determining whole, and human reason can apprehend its structure. From that Germanic crucible, Spinoza's ideas moved into the Romantic imagination. The poet Novalis, in his Hymns to the Night, invokes a divine nature that is both immanent and infinite, an echo of Spinoza's Deus sive Natura. The Romantic emphasis on feeling, on the awe of the natural world, can be read as a cultural response to the same monistic vision that Spinoza offered, a world where the distinction between the sacred and the material collapses. Yet the Romantics also introduced a tension. They celebrated the mystery of nature, while Spinoza had insisted that mystery is a product of ignorance, that true freedom lies in understanding the necessary order of the universe. This tension would later surface in the debates of the 20th century, when philosophers and scientists began to ask whether Spinoza's deterministic cosmos could accommodate the lived experience of difference, creativity, and change. One of the most striking modern endorsements of Spinoza's deterministic universe comes from Albert Einstein. In a 1929 letter to the philosopher Erich Gutkind, Einstein wrote, "I do not believe in a personal God, and I have never denied this but have expressed it clearly. The word God is for me nothing more than the expression and product of human weakness." He went further in a conversation with the Dutch physicist Hendrik Lorentz to say, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists." Einstein's admiration was not a casual nod. It was rooted in the way Spinoza's geometry of substance mirrored the geometric elegance of the field equations of general relativity. For Einstein, the universe was a single, self-consistent structure, governed by laws that could be discovered through rational inquiry. This view helped to cement Spinoza's reputation among physicists as a philosophical forebear of modern scientific naturalism. The bridge from Einstein to contemporary process philosophy is built upon the work of Alfred North Whitehead, whose Process and Reality reimagines the world as a series of interrelated events rather than static substances. Whitehead explicitly credits Spinoza for providing the first systematic attempt to understand the world as a single, interrelated whole. Yet Whitehead diverges sharply from Spinoza's strict substance monism. Where Spinoza posits one infinite substance with infinite attributes, Whitehead proposes an endless series of actual occasions that are both determinate and creative. In his Science and the Modern World, Whitehead writes, "The world is a network of interlocking processes, each of which is a becoming, not a being." This shift from static being to dynamic becoming can be seen as an evolution of Spinoza's thought, one that retains the core insight of unity while opening space for novelty and difference, an opening that will prove crucial for later ecological and ethical applications. Eco-spirituality, the contemporary movement that seeks to fuse ecological awareness with a sense of the sacred, finds a natural ally in Spinoza's ethics. The central Spinozist claim that the more we understand, the more we love, Deus sive Natura, provides a philosophical grounding for the idea that knowledge of ecological interdependence can foster genuine moral concern for the planet. In the early 21st century, environmental philosopher Michael Marder draws directly on Spinoza in his book Plant Thinking, arguing that to think of plants as part of a single living substance invites a new ethic of care that is not anthropocentric but ontologically inclusive. Marder's work, while not a textbook exposition of Spinoza, demonstrates how the old monistic framework can be repurposed to address the pressing moral crisis of climate change. Let us now turn to two concrete, modern case studies that illustrate how Spinoza's philosophy is being mobilized in the world today. The first concerns environmental activism. In the Pacific Northwest, a coalition of indigenous groups, climate scientists, and legal scholars formed the Spinoza Initiative in 2018, explicitly naming their effort after the Dutch philosopher. Their manifesto begins with a quotation from Ethics, Part III, Proposition 6, "The more we understand the causes of our actions, the more we can act according to reason." The initiative's strategy is to translate scientific data about carbon emissions into a moral narrative that emphasizes the rational love of nature as a shared substance. By framing the climate crisis as a failure of collective understanding rather than a simple policy disagreement, they appeal to Spinoza's idea that ethical action follows from clear knowledge of the necessary connections between human activity and environmental harm. Their campaigns have included public workshops where participants map out the causal chains linking fossil fuel consumption to ecosystem degradation, then collectively pledge to act according to the rational love of nature. Early evaluations suggest that participants report a deeper sense of responsibility and a higher likelihood of sustained behavioral change compared to traditional activist messaging. The second case study moves from the forests to the laboratory, where interdisciplinary teams of neuroscientists, philosophers, and computer scientists are exploring what they call monistic neuroscience. At the University of California, Berkeley, a research group led by Dr. Elena Martinez has embarked on a project titled Embodied Cognition in a Unified Ontology. Their central hypothesis draws on Spinoza's claim that mind and body are two attributes of the same substance, and they argue that separating neural processes from embodied experience is a false dichotomy. To test this, they combine functional MRI data with immersive virtual reality environments that alter participants' bodily perception. Their findings suggest that changes in bodily posture can modulate neural activity in regions traditionally associated with abstract reasoning, supporting a monistic view that cognition cannot be isolated from the body. In their published paper, they cite Spinoza's famous line, "The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things," as a guiding principle. The project has attracted funding from the National Science Foundation, precisely because it offers a philosophical framework that can integrate disparate data streams, neural, behavioral, and phenomenological, into a single explanatory model. Critics, we shall see, argue that this monistic ambition risks glossing over the genuine differences that exist within the brain's architecture, but the researchers maintain that their approach does not deny complexity. Rather, it situates complexity within a unified field of being. The resurgence of Spinoza's thought in the 20th century is itself a story worth telling. After his works were largely suppressed in the 18th century, a quiet revival began in the 1920s when the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, then a young graduate student, discovered a copy of Spinoza's Ethics in the library of the Sorbonne. Deleuze was struck not only by the rigor of Spinoza's geometric method, but also by the radical egalitarianism of his metaphysics, a single substance expressed in infinite modes, each equally real. Deleuze's seminars at the Collège de France, beginning in 1969, turned Spinoza into a touchstone for a new philosophy of difference. He rereads Spinoza's substance not as a static monolith but as a plane of immanence where differences are produced without a transcendent principle, in his book Spinoza. Practical Philosophy, Deleuze writes, Spinoza gives us the tools to think of the world as a field of forces, where each force is both a part and a whole. These seminars attracted a generation of thinkers, Mitchell Foucault, Felix Guattari, and later, the post-structuralist wave, who would both adopt and critique Spinoza's ideas. The Deleuze-Guattari collaboration, especially in A Thousand Plateaus, famously reconceptualizes rhizome as a model of multiplicity that owes a debt to Spinoza's rejection of hierarchical metaphysics. Yet the post-structuralist embrace of Spinoza was not without tension. Jacques Derrida, in a 1975 lecture titled Spinoza and the Question of Difference, warned that the totality of a single substance risks erasing the very differences it purports to include. For Derrida, the danger lay in the potential suppression of singularity and alterity, a critique that would later be echoed by feminist and post-colonial scholars. The critique sharpened in the 1990s, when the French theorist Jean-François Lyotard argued that Spinoza's deterministic framework left little room for the incredulity toward meta-narratives that he championed. Lyotard suggested that the monistic vision could be co-opted by totalizing ideologies, a concern that resurfaced in debates over the political uses of Spinoza's ethics. Parallel to the post-structuralist critique, a different line of opposition emerged from scientific materialists who reject any notion of God or nature as a metaphysical placeholder. In the early 21st century, philosopher of science Daniel Dennett wrote, Spinoza's God is a poetic metaphor, not a scientific hypothesis. From this perspective, the appeal to a single substance is seen as an unnecessary metaphysical commitment that adds nothing to the explanatory power of physics. Contemporary physicists who favor a strictly reductionist ontology often cite the success of particle physics and quantum field theory in describing the world without invoking a unifying substance. They argue that the universe can be understood as a collection of fields and particles whose interactions are governed by mathematical symmetries, not as a single, all-encompassing entity. The debate, however, has taken an unexpected turn with the rise of panpsychism and quantum field ontology. Panpsychism, the view that consciousness, or at least proto-conscious experience, is a fundamental feature of the world, resonates with Spinoza's claim that the intellect is a mode of the attribute of thought, which is one of the infinite attributes of the one substance. Contemporary philosophers such as Galen Strawson and Philip Goff argue that if we accept that mind is a fundamental attribute, then the gap between mental and physical dissolves, a move that mirrors Spinoza's monistic synthesis. In the realm of physics, some scholars, most notably the theoretical physicist Nick Herbert, have suggested that quantum fields themselves could be interpreted as a kind of mind-like substrate, a view that would bring Spinoza's idea of a single, infinite attribute of thought into dialogue with cutting-edge science. The convergence of these ideas has sparked a renewed interest in the philosophy of nature as a bridge between metaphysics, neuroscience, and climate ethics. Climate ethics, in particular, provides a fertile ground for Spinoza's legacy. The philosopher Timothy Morton, known for his theory of dark ecology, writes, "We must think of the Earth not as a resource but as an assemblage of forces. A single living system." Morton's assemblage theory is indebted to Spinoza's notion that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. By treating the climate system as a monistic whole, activists can argue for policies that respect the interdependence of human and non-human actors. In practice, this perspective has been adopted by the One Earth Initiative, a coalition of NGOs that frames climate mitigation as a collective rational love for the shared substance of Earth. Their policy proposals emphasize integrated solutions, renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, and circular economies, grounded in the idea that no part of the system can be altered without affecting the whole. Critics, however, caution that such holistic thinking can obscure the distributional injustices that climate change produces, a concern reminiscent of the post-structuralist critique that monism may flatten difference. To see the living tension between these perspectives, consider the story of the 2015 International Spinoza Conference held in Utrecht. The conference brought together scholars from philosophy, physics, biology, and activism. One of the most talked about panels featured a debate between Dr. Laura Sanchez, a philosopher of mind who defends a Spinozan monism, and Dr. Marcus Liu, a quantum physicist who embraces a many-worlds interpretation. Sanchez opened with a quotation from Ethics, Part I, Proposition 15, "Whatever is in God, and nothing can be or be conceived without God." She argued that the quantum field with its entangled particles provides a modern empirical analog of Spinoza's infinite substance. Liu countered, the mathematics of quantum theory does not require a metaphysical substrate, it only requires a formalism that predicts observations. The exchange highlighted how Spinoza's ideas can serve both as a bridge and as a battleground for contemporary scientific and philosophical discourse. Another anecdote illustrates the cultural reach of Spinoza beyond academia. In 2019, the Japanese visual artist Haruki Murakami, known for his novels that blend the surreal with the mundane, hosted an exhibition titled Nature as Substance. The centerpiece was a series of installations that used light, sound, and kinetic sculptures to evoke the sense of a single, flowing reality. In the exhibition catalog, Murakami quoted Spinoza, "The more we understand the causes of our emotions, the more we become masters of them." He explained that his work sought to make viewers feel the unity of body and mind, echoing Spinoza's claim that the mind's highest virtue is the intellectual love of God. This artistic appropriation shows how Spinoza's metaphysics can inspire not only scholarly analysis, but also creative expression that touches the public imagination. Returning to the philosophical terrain, we must consider how Spinoza's monism is being reinterpreted in the light of contemporary neuroscience. The interdisciplinary project at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, led by Dr. Anja Hoffman, adopts a Spinozan framework to study the emergence of consciousness. Their approach treats neural networks as expressions of a single underlying informational field, akin to Spinoza's attribute of thought. They employ techniques from network science, measuring the degree of integration and differentiation in brain activity, and argue that higher levels of integration correspond to the intellectual love that Spinoza describes as the highest form of knowledge. In a recent interview, Hoffman said, "If we view the brain not as a collection of isolated modules, but as a manifestation of a unified informational substance, we can better understand how subjective experience arises without invoking a mysterious soul." This perspective aligns with recent work in integrated information theory, which proposes a quantitative measure of consciousness that could be seen as a modern, scientific analog of Spinoza's idea that the intellect and the affect are two aspects of the same reality. Yet the monistic ambition is not without its detractors. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek, in a 2020 essay on Spinoza and the ideology of unity, warned that the celebration of a single substance can become an ideological tool that masks the structural antagonisms of capitalist society. Žižek's argument draws on Marxist critiques, suggesting that a universalist metaphysics may be co-opted to justify the status quo, smoothing over the very differences that drive social change. This line of criticism echoes the earlier post-structuralist concerns that monism, by erasing difference, may inadvertently support oppressive structures. In response, contemporary defenders of Spinoza argue that his ethics is fundamentally anti-authoritarian. Spinoza wrote, "The more the mind understands, the more it loves, and the more it loves, the more it acts according to reason." This chain from understanding to love to rational action implies a political ethic of empowerment, not domination. Modern scholars such as Rebecca Goldstein have emphasized that Spinoza's political writings, especially his theological political treatise, advocate for a democratic society where individuals are free to pursue rational understanding. The treatise famously asserts the desire for freedom is the most natural of all human desires. By linking rational understanding to freedom, Spinoza provides a philosophical foundation for democratic activism that can be, and has been, mobilized in contemporary movements for social and environmental justice. The interplay between Spinoza's monism and contemporary scientific theories also invites us to examine the notion of a quantum field ontology. In quantum field theory, particles are seen not as isolated entities, but as excitations of underlying fields that permeate space. This resonates with Spinoza's claim that the attribute of extension is infinite, and the attribute of thought is also infinite. Some philosophers, such as Tim Maudlin, have suggested that the field view offers a metaphysical picture that is structurally similar to Spinoza's substance. Yet others caution that the analogy is limited. Quantum fields are mathematically defined entities that do not necessarily carry the normative, ethical implications that Spinoza attaches to his substance. The debate continues, with interdisciplinary workshops exploring whether a Spinozan quantum field could serve as a bridge between physics and ethics, perhaps providing a common language for addressing climate change, where the physical processes of the atmosphere and the moral responsibilities of human agents intersect. In the realm of climate ethics, the concept of planetary stewardship has been framed using Spinozan language. The philosopher John B. Cobb Jr., a leading figure in process theology, writes, "If we accept that the earth is a living, thinking whole, then caring for it becomes an act of self-care." Cobb's work draws directly on Spinoza's Ethics, Part IV, Proposition 6. The more we understand the causes of our actions, the more we become masters of them. By understanding the causal links between industrial activity and climate disruption, humanity can align its actions with the rational love of the earth as substance. This line of reasoning underpins the Earth Charter initiative, which seeks to embed ecological responsibility into international law, presenting it not merely as a pragmatic necessity, but as a moral imperative rooted in a shared ontological reality. To see how this plays out in practice, consider the case of the Blue Ocean Alliance, a coalition of marine biologists, policymakers, and indigenous leaders working to protect the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Their strategy is built on a Spinozan narrative. They present the ocean as a single living substance whose health reflects the health of all its modes. Their outreach materials quote Spinoza: "All things that exist are in God, and nothing can exist or be conceived without God." By framing plastic pollution as a violation of the rational love owed to the ocean as substance, they have succeeded in garnering public support that goes beyond simple environmentalism, appealing to a deeper sense of unity and responsibility. The modern revival of Spinoza's ideas also finds expression in the digital sphere. In 2021, a virtual community called the Spinoza Network launched a series of webinars titled Monism in the Age of AI. Participants explored how Spinoza's view that mind and body are attributes of one substance could inform debates about artificial intelligence and consciousness. One speaker, a computer scientist named Dr. Ravi Patel, argued that if we treat artificial systems as modes of a broader informational substance, we can develop ethical frameworks that respect their emergent properties without anthropomorphizing them. The discussion highlighted how Spinoza's metaphysics can provide a fresh perspective on contemporary technological dilemmas, suggesting that the monistic lens remains a fertile ground for interdisciplinary inquiry. Of course, not all contemporary engagements with Spinoza are affirmative. The philosopher Quentin Meillassoux, known for his critique of correlationism, contends that Spinoza's monism locks the world into a closed system of necessity, leaving no room for absolute contingency. Meillassoux' speculative materialism insists on the possibility of a world that is not bound by any underlying substance, a stance that directly challenges Spinoza's deterministic framework. In a 2018 debate at the University of Paris, Meillassoux argued that the universe could have been otherwise and that possibility is the ultimate freedom. Spinoza's response, if he were present, would likely have been to point back to his own proposition that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, emphasizing that freedom is found not in the ability to be otherwise, but in the rational understanding of why things are as they are. The dialogue between Spinoza and contemporary thought thus unfolds across multiple dimensions: philosophical, scientific, ethical, and artistic. It is a dialogue that refuses to settle into a simple narrative of influence or rejection. Instead, it is a dynamic conversation that continually reshapes both the ancient text and the modern contexts in which it is read. As we reflect on this legacy, it is worth recalling Spinoza's own humble words from the Ethics, Part V, Proposition 24. "The more we understand, the more we love." This simple yet profound insight invites us to see every new scientific discovery, every activist movement, every artistic expression as an invitation to deepen our understanding of the single, immanent reality that Spinoza called both God and nature. In closing, let us imagine a metaphor that ties together the many threads we have followed. Picture a river that winds through a landscape, gathering tributaries, reflecting the sky, carving valleys, and nourishing forests. The river is both water and movement, both a physical substance and a dynamic process. Spinoza's monism can be seen as the recognition that the water, the current, the riverbank, and the life it sustains are all expressions of a single underlying reality. The Enlightenment philosophers saw the river as a symbol of rational order. The Romantics felt its awe-inspiring beauty. Einstein mapped its flow onto the curvature of spacetime. Whitehead described its ever-changing becoming. Activists now call upon its health as a moral duty. Neuroscientists trace the currents of neural activity as patterns of the same flow, and critics warn that the metaphor must not erase the distinctiveness of each tributary. The river then becomes a living illustration of Spinoza's claim that the universe is a single, interconnected whole, and that our task, as rational beings, is to understand its currents, love its course, and act in harmony with its inevitable direction. Thus, as we move forward in our own intellectual journeys, let us carry with us the quiet, reflective invitation that Spinoza offers, to seek knowledge, to nurture love, and to recognize that in the grand tapestry of existence, every thread, every mode, every thought, and every breath belongs to the same boundless substance. May that invitation continue to inspire philosophers, scientists, activists, and artists alike, guiding us toward a world where understanding and love walk hand in hand along the ever-turning river of life.